Tonight we enter a world where gods and mortals once walked the earth, yet beneath the incense, marble, bronze, and temple song, there lived a darker truth, a truth scratched into clay tablets, stamped into metal collars, buried in household rubbish, and sealed beneath the ash of ruined cities. The brutal reality of ancient slavery was not merely that one human being could own another. It was that the entire world around the enslaved person was arranged to make escape feel almost impossible. Tonight we ask a hard question, one that echoes across the wide banks of the Euphrates, the sun-white fields of Egypt, the hills of Greece, the crowded streets of Rome, and the silent roads of empires long vanished. Why did so many enslaved people remain trapped, even when chains were not always visible? Why was flight so dangerous, so rare, and so often doomed? Archaeology gives us the first cold fragments of the answer. In Rome, iron collars have been found with inscriptions warning anyone who discovered the runaway to return him to his master. One such collar declares in plain words that the wearer had fled and must be brought back. It is a small object, but it speaks with terrifying force. This was not a symbol only of punishment. It was a portable notice, a legal command, a public advertisement of ownership placed around a living throat. In the ancient Near East, cuneiform tablets record the sale, hire, inheritance, and recovery of enslaved people, with the same administrative calm used for livestock, fields, and grain. In Egypt, painted tomb scenes show servants, labourers, and captives arranged in the grand machinery of household and state. In Greece, legal speeches reveal disputes over ownership, testimony, and punishment. In Rome, jurists wrote with chilling precision about the status of the enslaved, reducing breathing human beings to property under law. Stratigraphic excavation, radiocarbon dating, lithic analysis, and the study of ancient settlement patterns do not merely uncover palaces and temples. They expose systems. They show the places where people laboured, slept, cooked, carried water, cut stone, harvested grain, and disappeared from memory. Genomic data from ancient cemeteries sometimes reveals movement across vast distances, hinting at lives uprooted by war, trade, capture, and forced migration. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The enslaved rarely wrote their own stories. Their voices survive mostly through the records of those who controlled them. Yet silence is not absence. A lock, a collar, a shackle, a cramped room near a kitchen hearth, a burial without goods, a skeleton marked by repetitive strain. All of these are witnesses. They ask us to look closely. They ask us not to turn away. To understand why escape was nearly impossible, we must first understand that ancient slavery was not a single institution with one face. It existed in royal palaces, rural estates, army camps, mines, workshops, temples, ships, and private homes. Some enslaved people were highly skilled scribes, tutors, accountants, singers, doctors, or artisans. Others were worked to death in fields, quarries, and mines where the sun and dust became part of their punishment. Some lived near power, handling keys, accounts, children, and secrets. Others were kept at the edge of survival, known only by their labour. This variety can mislead the modern imagination. It may tempt some to believe that ancient slavery was softer than later forms of bondage, but comfort for a few did not erase terror for many. A trusted household servant could be sold without warning. A skilled worker could be beaten. A child born into slavery could inherit the condition of the mother. A woman could be exploited not only for labour, but for her body. A man who had served faithfully for decades could still remain property. The central fact remained absolute. The enslaved person did not possess secure control over his or her own life. Escape, therefore, was not simply a matter of running through a gate at night. It meant fleeing a legal identity. It meant abandoning any children, spouse, parents, or friends left behind. It meant entering landscapes where every village might be suspicious, every road might carry soldiers or merchants, every marketplace might contain someone eager for reward. It meant crossing borders that did not guarantee freedom. It meant finding food without money, shelter without protection, and trust in a world trained to betray the fugitive. Imagine an enslaved person in a Roman estate outside the city, listening in darkness as dogs stir near the courtyard. The roads are known, but too well known. The milestones bear the authority of the same empire that protects the owner. The inns are watched. The towns require explanations. Clothing marks class. Speech reveals origin. Accent betrays distance. Papers may be demanded. A scar, brand, collar, or simply the fear in the eyes may be enough. The body itself becomes evidence. Or imagine a captive taken in war somewhere beyond the eastern frontier, carried into Mesopotamia, sold into a household where the language of command is strange. The sky is unfamiliar, the river bends in ways unknown, the gods have different names. To flee is to move through lands where directions are uncertain and kinship networks are gone. In such a world, loneliness becomes a wall higher than stone. The ancient world was full of movement, but not all movement was free. Merchants, sailors, soldiers, pilgrims, and messengers travelled along roads, rivers, and sea lanes. Yet these routes were also systems of recognition. People belonged to households, cities, tribes, temples, guilds, patrons, and masters. A person without a recognized place could become instantly vulnerable. Freedom required not only distance from bondage, but acceptance into another social order. Without that, the runaway could be seized again, cheated, enslaved by someone else, or killed. This is the cruel genius of slavery in antiquity. It did not depend only on chains. It depended on law, fear, poverty, geography, violence, custom, and the cooperation of ordinary people. The master did not have to stand at every road. Society itself stood there. The innkeeper, the farmer, the guard, the trader, the neighbour, the official, and sometimes even another enslaved person might become part of the net. And yet, people still ran. They ran across fields under moonlight. They slipped from harbours. They vanished into armies. They hid in temples. They begged strangers for help. They gambled everything on weather, darkness, confusion, and mercy. Some failed within hours. Some survived for years. Some changed names and disappeared into the vast breathing body of the ancient world. Their stories are usually answerless, adrift to ponder, because the archive remembers the owner who searched more often than the person who fled. The question of escape is therefore not only historical, it is human. It forces us to ask what freedom means when the road itself is hostile, when law denies your personhood, when hunger follows every step, and when hope must move in silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we settle into this long night of ancient memory, tell me where you are watching from and what the local time is in your corner of the world. At dawn, the market began to breathe. Before the shouting rose, before the bargaining hands, before the dust lifted beneath sandals and hooves, there was a quieter hour when human lives were arranged like goods. A rope might be loosened, a wrist might be inspected, a mouth forced open to show teeth, a back turned toward the buyer, not as a person turns toward another person, but as an animal is turned beneath a measuring eye. In the ancient world, the market of flesh was not hidden in some secret underworld. It stood beside grain, oil, wool, metalwork, perfume, pottery, and livestock. It belonged to the public face of civilization. This is one of the harshest truths preserved by the ancient record. Slavery did not exist only at the margins. It was woven into the ordinary economy of cities that built temples to justice, carved hymns to the gods, and produced philosophy, mathematics, law, poetry, and astronomy. The same hands that raised sanctuaries and copied sacred words might also record the sale of a child, the transfer of a woman, the price of a captured soldier, or the rental of a labourer for harvest. The first path into bondage was war. Across the ancient world, victory was measured not only in land and tribute, but in bodies. When armies broke city walls, when villages burned, when frontier raids swept through valleys, captives became one of the spoils of conquest. Men, women, and children could be marched away from the smoke of their homes and divided among commanders, soldiers, temples, rulers, or merchants. The defeated did not simply lose a battle. They could lose their names, languages, families, and futures. On palace reliefs, kings often present victory as divine order restored. Enemies kneel. Prisoners are led by cords. Foreign lands bow before the ruler chosen by heaven. Yet beneath this grand political imagery lay a more intimate catastrophe. A mother who had known every turn of her village path might suddenly be driven across a desert road. A boy who had watched sheep beside a familiar hill might be sold in a coastal town where no one knew his father's name. A craftsman taken from a conquered city might live on, still using his skill, but now under another man's command. War made slavery seem natural to empires, because conquest created strangers. The captive was foreign, defeated, and often described as belonging outside the moral community of the victor. Ancient states used this distance to silence pity. A person taken from beyond the border could be imagined as lesser, dangerous, cursed, barbarous, or simply available. Once stripped from kin and homeland, the captive became easier to sell. The second path was debt. This form of bondage carried a different sorrow, because it could grow from ordinary misfortune, a failed harvest, a sick animal, unpaid tax, drought, flood, or interest owed to a creditor could pull a household toward ruin. In some societies, debt bondage allowed a person to pledge labour, or even the labour of relatives, until an obligation was satisfied. Yet in practice, debt could become a pit with smooth walls, interest multiplied. Powerful creditors controlled records, poor families lacked witnesses, hunger made resistance impossible. Imagine a farmer after a season without rain. The soil has cracked, the barley has failed, the jars are nearly empty. Children cry through the night, not from injury, but from the slow ache of hunger. A creditor offers grain, seed, or silver. The price is not only repayment, it is dependence. A son may be sent away. A daughter may enter service. A father may bind himself to labour he cannot freely leave. In such cases, slavery did not arrive through the thunder of armies. It entered through the door as hunger. The third path was birth. This was perhaps the most merciless of all, because it made bondage hereditary. A child born to an enslaved mother could enter the world already claimed. Before the infant knew speech, before memory, before the first independent step, society might assign ownership. The cradle itself could stand inside another person's property. Such children grew up learning the geography of subordination before they understood its meaning. The courtyard, the storeroom, the stable, the loom room, the field boundary, these formed their first universe. For them, escape was not the recovery of a lost freedom remembered from childhood. It was the pursuit of something never personally possessed, but perhaps whispered about, glimpsed in others, imagined in dreams. The tragedy here is difficult to measure through archaeology, because infants do not leave contracts in their own hands. Yet legal documents, household inventories, and manumission records reveal that children could be counted, transferred, trained, punished, and inherited. Their small lives were absorbed into the machinery of ownership. The fourth path was piracy and kidnapping. Ancient seas glittered with trade, but also with danger. Ships crossed waters carrying wine, grain, copper, timber, ivory, glass, spices, and human beings. A fishing boat taken near shore, a merchant vessel seized between islands, a traveller captured on a lonely road. All could be transformed into commodities. Pirates and raiders understood the value of flesh. A person could be ransomed if wealthy, sold if poor, exploited if useful. The sea, so often praised by poets, could become an open mouth. In coastal regions, fear of abduction was part of life. A sail on the horizon might mean trade, news, kin returning, or disaster. Black sails sighted off the shore could send families inland. Harbours were places of opportunity and dread. There, a stolen life could pass quickly from hand to hand. A captive taken in one place might be sold in another before anyone at home even knew what had happened. The fifth path was abandonment and exposure. In societies where poverty, shame, disability, illegitimacy, or famine placed infants at terrible risk, unwanted children could be left to die. Some were found and raised, but not always as free members of a household. Rescue could become possession. A child saved from the roadside might be brought up as a servant, worker, or slave. The moral language of mercy could conceal economic calculation. A life spared might still be a life owned. The sixth path was punishment. Courts and rulers could condemn criminals, rebels, tax defaulters, or political enemies to forced labour. The boundary between legal sentence and enslavement could be thin. Mines, quarries, public works, and state projects required bodies. The condemned person might vanish into a labour force where individuality no longer mattered. There, the state itself became the master, and survival depended on endurance. What united all these paths was not origin, but transformation. War captive, debtor, child, kidnapped traveller, abandoned infant, condemned prisoner. Each could be pushed through a social doorway from personhood into property. The market made that transformation visible. Buyers asked practical questions. Could this person carry stone, grind grain, nurse a child, copy accounts, sing, cook, fight, warm a bed, manage a household, work a loom, survive the mines? The answers determined price, not dignity. Age mattered. Strength mattered. Beauty mattered. Skill mattered. Obedience mattered. Origin mattered. A trained scribe could command more than a field hand. A young domestic servant might be valued differently from an elderly labourer. A captured artisan could be worth preserving. A rebellious captive might be worth less, or might be punished into submission before sale. Human value was calculated through usefulness, and usefulness was defined by the owner. The market also destroyed continuity. It separated brothers from sisters, husbands from wives, mothers from children, teachers from apprentices, elders from the young who carried their memories. Separation itself became a tool of control. A person alone was easier to command than a family rooted together. Ancient slavery fed on this loneliness. It turned kinship into vulnerability, because love could be used as a hostage. And still, within this darkness, the enslaved did not become empty. They remembered. They adapted. They prayed. They taught children songs from lost homes. They hid small acts of refusal inside obedience. They learned the moods of masters, the timing of gates, the language of buyers, the value of silence. They carried inward worlds no contract could fully possess. Yet the market's purpose was to make those inward worlds irrelevant. It reduced history to condition, grief to price, and destiny to ownership. That was why escape began long before anyone ran. It began in the moment a person realized that the world had renamed them without consent, and that every road back to themselves would be guarded. Law was the invisible wall. It did not need to rattle like iron. It did not need to glitter in the sun. It could sit quietly on a tablet, in a court, in the memory of a magistrate, in the mouth of a witness, in the seal of a contract, in the habit of a city that had decided some people were born to command and others to be commanded. In the ancient world, slavery endured not only because masters were strong, but because law taught society how to see the enslaved. A chain could be broken, a door could be opened, a field could be crossed under darkness. But a legal condition followed like a second shadow. It moved with the fugitive into the road, the harbour, the market, the shrine, the workshop, and the village gate. The enslaved person might change clothing, name, pace, and direction, yet the law remained behind him and around him, waiting to reclaim the body as property. Ancient legal systems were diverse, and no single code governed every land. Still, across many societies, one principle appears again and again with severe clarity. The enslaved person was not treated as a fully independent legal actor. In some places, he or she could possess small savings, manage tasks, conduct limited business, or even rise close to the centre of household power. But these possibilities existed inside permission. They did not erase ownership. They were privileges that could be withdrawn. To be marked by law was to live beneath a status that changed every ordinary human action. Marriage could become uncertain. Family bonds could be ignored in sale. Testimony could be restricted, distrusted, or extracted through torture. Movement could require approval. Property, when allowed, might be vulnerable. Injury to the enslaved could be treated less as harm to a person than damage to an owner's asset. The deepest violence of this arrangement was philosophical. Law did not merely punish the enslaved. It translated them into a category beneath citizenship, beneath household authority, beneath public honour. This mattered profoundly for escape. A fugitive did not simply leave a cruel master. He or she violated a recognised property claim. The owner could demand assistance. Officials could intervene. Buyers could be warned. Neighbours could be required or encouraged to report. A person who sheltered a runaway risked accusation, fine, or conflict with local power. Thus law turned compassion into danger. It made kindness costly. Consider the ancient city at morning. The gates open, farmers enter with baskets, donkeys carry firewood, merchants unfold cloth, bakers scrape ash from ovens. Officials take their places near records, weights, seals, and petitions. Somewhere in that movement is a runaway trying to become ordinary. But the city is not merely a crowd. It is an organised memory. People know who belongs where. They know households, patrons, masters, foreigners, freed people, clients, debtors, soldiers, and strangers. A person without a clear place invites questions. What is your name? Who is your father? Where is your household? Who employs you? From what town do you come? Why are you travelling alone? Such questions could be harmless to the free and deadly to the enslaved. The ancient world often relied on personal recognition rather than modern documents. Yet that did not mean anonymity was easy. In tightly woven communities, identity lived in relationships. To be unknown was not freedom, it was exposure. Law gave those questions teeth. In some societies, formal marks reinforced legal status. Brands, tattoos, collars, shaved heads, distinctive clothing, or scars from punishment could announce a person's condition. Not every enslaved person carried visible marks, and practices varied widely. Yet the possibility itself changed the atmosphere of flight. The fugitive had to fear not only pursuit, but inspection. A hand might seize the chin, a sleeve might be lifted, a back might be examined, a passerby might look too long at a healed wound or a nervous glance. Law also shaped speech. In courts, the testimony of enslaved people was often treated differently from that of the free. In some ancient legal cultures, torture was considered a method for extracting truthful statements from slaves, a horrifying belief rooted in the assumption that the enslaved body could be broken for evidence. This created a world where the fugitive, if captured, might not simply be returned. He or she could be interrogated through pain, especially if accused of theft, conspiracy, seduction, arson, or assisting others to flee. Such laws trained masters to think of control as a right. They trained neighbours to think of intervention as order. They trained the enslaved to understand that even truth might not protect them. A person could tell a story of cruelty, hunger, violation, or fear, and the court might still see primarily a missing possession. The household was also a legal unit. In many ancient societies, the senior male head, or the recognized owner, wielded immense authority over dependents. Slaves existed within this domestic command structure. Their labor, sexuality, reproduction, punishment, and movement could be regulated by household needs. The private home, often imagined as a place of warmth and family, could become a legal fortress inside its walls. Discipline might remain unseen by public authority unless disorder threatened neighbours, property, or elite reputation. For women in slavery, the legal prison could be especially intimate. Their bodies could be claimed for labour, reproduction, nursing, household service, and sexual access. A child born from exploitation might still become property. Emotional bonds formed under coercion could be denied legal protection. Escape for such women often meant leaving children behind or carrying them into even greater danger. The law did not simply restrict movement, it invaded kinship. For men, too, law could sever the self. An enslaved man might manage accounts, supervise other labourers, serve in a workshop, or accompany a master in public, yet his competence did not equal autonomy. He might handle money that was not his, guard doors he could not freely pass, deliver messages on roads he could not choose to follow. The law could use his intelligence while denying his independence. Even when manumission existed, freedom could remain conditional and socially constrained. A freed person might owe duties to a former master, now transformed into a patron. Names, obligations, and public identity could still carry traces of bondage. Legal freedom was precious, but it did not always erase stigma. This reality made flight even more perilous. A runaway who attempted to invent a free identity needed more than distance. He needed believable social roots, witnesses, work, speech, clothing, and luck. The ancient legal imagination loved categories: citizen and foreigner, freeborn and freed, legitimate and illegitimate, master and slave, male and female, conqueror and conquered. These divisions did not merely describe the world, they made the world governable. Slavery survived because it occupied one of the most useful categories for power. It answered difficult questions with cruel simplicity. Who will work the fields? Who will clean the house? Who will mine the silver? Who will row the ship? Who will bear the blame? Who can be sold when debts rise? Who can be punished without scandal? The answer, again and again, was the enslaved. This is why escape was more than a physical act. It was an argument against the entire order of things. The fugitive body declared that law had lied. It declared that ownership did not erase humanity. It declared that a person written into a ledger as property still had a will, a memory, and a future imagined beyond the master's reach. But law was patient. It waited in contracts. It waited in courts. It waited in inheritance disputes, sale records, harbour checks, tax lists, and household claims. It waited in the minds of people who had been taught that returning a runaway was not cruelty, but justice. And so the enslaved person who dreamed of flight faced an enemy larger than one owner. The enemy was a civilization that had made captivity ordinary. The road away from bondage passed not only through fields and gates, but through language itself, through every word that said master, property, obedience, and return. Geography was a prison without walls. To modern eyes, a map may look open, a line of road, a green valley, a river winding toward the sea, a chain of hills under blue morning light. Distance appears measurable, direction appears simple, north, south, east, west. Yet for an enslaved person in the ancient world, landscape was not an invitation. It was a test designed by hunger, fear, weather, language, and the limits of the human body. The first barrier was distance itself. Ancient travel was slow, painful, and exposed. A person on foot could not vanish with speed. Every mile had to be purchased through muscle and breath. Feet cracked, thirst burned. Night brought cold, day brought visibility. A road that seemed to promise escape also carried witnesses. The more travelled it was, the more dangerous it became. The less travelled it was, the more deadly it became. The great roads of empire were built for armies, merchants, messengers, tax collectors, and officials. They served power before they served the desperate. A fugitive stepping onto such a road entered a corridor of observation. Inns, wells, ferry crossings, toll stations, bridges, and city gates created places where strangers might be noticed. A runaway could not simply walk forever without speaking. Food had to be obtained, water had to be found, directions had to be asked, shelter had to be begged, stolen, or improvised. Even the landscape itself demanded knowledge. A free traveller moved through familiar signs. A shepherd knew which ridge held winter pasture. A farmer knew where wells survived in dry months. A sailor knew the moods of wind near certain islands. A trader knew which towns welcomed outsiders and which demanded suspicion. The enslaved fugitive often lacked this knowledge, especially if torn from a distant homeland. To run through unfamiliar country was to read a book written in a language one did not know. Deserts were among the most merciless barriers in the Near East, North Africa, and frontier zones of many ancient states. Arid lands could swallow the unprepared within days. The desert did not need guards. It had sun, thirst, mirage, and silence. Water was not evenly scattered across the world. Wells belonged to communities, caravans, temples, forts, or tribes. To approach a well was to approach people. To avoid people was to risk death. Thus the fugitive faced a cruel choice between exposure and dehydration. In the open heat, the body becomes an alarm. Sweat dries. The tongue thickens. Thoughts slow. The horizon trembles. A person running from bondage might begin with courage, but courage does not fill a water skin. Every step away from a settlement could increase freedom from the master, while decreasing the chance of survival. The desert was not empty. It was governed by those who knew it. Without alliance, the fugitive was alone before a geography older and stronger than any law. Mountains offered another kind of danger. They promised hiding places, caves, forests, goat paths, and high ridges beyond easy pursuit. Yet mountains also punished ignorance. Paths vanished into rock. Weather changed suddenly. A clear day in the valley could become freezing mist above. Loose stones betrayed footsteps. Hunger sharpened quickly where fields were absent. Communities in mountain regions might be fiercely independent, but they were not automatically merciful to strangers. A runaway could be treated as a threat, a thief, a spy, or a burden. Forests could conceal, but concealment is not the same as safety. Ancient forests were not gentle green sanctuaries. They held wolves, snakes, bandits, marsh fever, thorn, darkness, and disorientation. Under trees, the sky disappeared. A person could circle unknowingly for hours. Night sounds grew enormous. Every branch crack might be a pursuer. Every shadow might be an animal or a man. Without fire, cold and fear pressed close. With fire, smoke betrayed location. Rivers were both pathways and borders. The Euphrates, the Nile, the Tiber, the Danube, and countless smaller rivers carried trade, armies, grain, timber, and rumour. To follow a river could help a fugitive maintain direction and find water. But rivers also drew settlements. Their banks were watched because life gathered there. Ferries and bridges were choke points. A person who could not pay, could not explain, or could not swim might be trapped on the bank. A broad river in flood was a moving wall. Seas glittered with possibility, but they were even harder to cross. The ancient Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Arabian Sea, and coastal waters elsewhere connected civilizations. Yet ships required access. A fugitive had to board somehow. That meant entering a harbour, one of the most observed places in the ancient world. Harbours smelled of pitch, fish, salt, sweat, and wet rope. They rang with languages, deals, insults, oaths, and the creak of cargo. A runaway could hide among sailors. But sailors were practical people. Some might help, some might sell, some might return the fugitive for reward, some might enslave the person anew. Islands intensified the problem. To flee from an island estate, mine, or household required water crossing. Even a narrow channel could be impossible without a boat. A coastline might be visible in the distance, shimmering like a promise, yet remain unreachable. The sea made captivity picturesque from afar and absolute up close. Borders were not always lines on a map. They could be zones of shifting authority, tribal lands, imperial frontiers, military roads, desert edges, river crossings, and mountain passes. A fugitive might imagine safety beyond the reach of a particular city or master. Yet crossing into another political world did not guarantee freedom. Neighbouring societies often practiced slavery too. A stranger without protection might be seized by a new owner. The escape from one cage could become entry into another. Language was a geography of its own. An enslaved person taken far from home might carry an accent like a visible wound. Speech could reveal foreignness, social rank, or deception. Silence could also betray. In a village where strangers were rare, not speaking enough might be as dangerous as speaking poorly. Every conversation became a crossing. Every question became a river. Clothing created another boundary. Ancient garments signalled region, gender, work, wealth, and status. A fugitive dressed in rough labour clothing might be suspected as a runaway. Dressed too finely, he might be challenged. Without proper sandals, the road would wound him. Without a cloak, the night would punish him. Without a head covering in certain climates, the sun would weaken him. Escape required not only courage but costume, and costume required resources. Food was perhaps the most relentless guard. An enslaved person fleeing through farmland might see grain ripening, figs hanging, olives dark in their groves, goats moving behind stone walls, and smoke rising from ovens. Yet all of it belonged to someone. To steal was to risk pursuit. To beg was to risk recognition. To work for food was to remain in one place long enough to be questioned. Hunger narrowed choices until every moral line became a survival calculation. The body kept its own record. A fugitive could hide a name, but not exhaustion. Limping, shaking, hunger, wounds, sunburn, torn clothing, and fear could announce crisis. The ancient world demanded physical endurance from everyone, but a runaway needed endurance under secrecy. There was no safe rest. Sleep itself became dangerous. To close the eyes under a tree, behind a wall, in a ditch, or near a shrine was to surrender awareness to chance. Even the stars, those ancient companions of sailors and shepherds, were not enough. To navigate by them required skill, calm, and an open sky. Panic distorts direction. Clouds erase the heavens. Mountains hide the horizon. Cities glow faintly with fire and sound, pulling the desperate toward danger because danger may still contain bread. This is why geography did not simply surround ancient slavery. It strengthened it. Masters understood that the world beyond the gate was not empty freedom. It was a maze of need. The enslaved person might flee from human cruelty only to meet the cruelty of terrain. The road required knowledge, friends, supplies, language, strength, and luck. Without these, escape became not a journey, but an unravelling. Still, some ran into deserts, some climbed mountains, some followed rivers by moonlight, some hid in ship holds beneath cargo, some crossed forests with bleeding feet. The landscape that imprisoned them also offered cracks, shadows, storms, and secret paths. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what bones, letters, names, or forgotten records may reveal about those who vanished into the ancient earth and were never found. The household watched with many eyes. In the ancient world, the home was not always a private refuge of softness and peace. For the enslaved, it could be a theatre of constant attention, where every gesture was measured, every absence noticed, every whisper weighed. The roof that sheltered also enclosed. The courtyard that gathered daily life also exposed daily movement. The hearth that warmed the room also kept the servant near the centre of command. A large household was a living machine. It woke before dawn, long before the master appeared in public dignity. Fires had to be revived from coals, water had to be drawn, grain had to be ground, lamps had to be cleaned, animals had to be fed, children had to be washed, floors had to be swept, bread had to be prepared, clothing had to be folded, patched, beaten clean, or perfumed according to wealth. Doors had to be opened at the proper hour and closed at the proper hour. Messages had to be carried. Guests had to be received. Food had to arrive not merely cooked, but timed, arranged, and served according to rank. Inside such a place, to escape was difficult because routine made absence visible. A field labourer might be missed at the morning count. A cook might be missed when the fire failed. A nurse might be missed when the child cried. A doorkeeper might be missed when a visitor waited. A groom might be missed when the animal stood unfed. A maidservant might be missed when the mistress called for oil, linen, or a comb. Enslaved people were often embedded so deeply into daily function that their disappearance created immediate disorder. Disorder provoked questions. Questions provoked search. The household did not rely only on the master's gaze. It contained hierarchies among the enslaved themselves. Some were supervisors, some were trusted, some were older and responsible for younger workers, some managed storerooms, keys, accounts, or specialized tasks. Some had small privileges that depended on obedience. In such an environment, surveillance could flow sideways as much as downward. One enslaved person might report another from fear, rivalry, coercion, ambition, or a desperate hope of favour. The system did not merely divide free from enslaved, it divided the enslaved from one another. This was one of slavery's most efficient cruelties. It turned community into uncertainty. A whispered plan could become a sentence. A friend could be tortured into confession. A jealous rival could invent suspicion. A frightened child could repeat words heard at night. Even love had to be guarded, because the more people who knew a secret, the more fragile it became. The architecture of ancient homes often intensified control. Many houses were arranged around courtyards, corridors, storage rooms, kitchens, workshops, and sleeping spaces that made movement visible to others. In elite homes, entrances might be controlled by doorkeepers. In rural estates, outbuildings, barns, presses, and workers' quarters could be placed where overseers could monitor labour. The boundary between inside and outside was not neutral. Gates, thresholds, and sleeping arrangements formed a geography of obedience. Night did not always bring liberty. In some places doors were barred, tools were secured, animals were stabled, valuable goods were locked away. Dogs might roam courtyards or estates. Other servants slept nearby. The master's household continued breathing in darkness, full of sleepers who might wake at a sound. To flee at night required timing. A latch had to be opened without noise. A dog had to be avoided or quieted. A path through familiar spaces had to be taken without stumbling. The body had to move through terror with the delicacy of smoke. Urban household presented one kind of trap. Streets offered crowds, alleys, markets, and confusion, but they also offered recognition. Neighbours knew faces, shopkeepers saw who came and went, water carriers, bakers, porters, guards, and other servants formed a network of ordinary observation. A runaway from a city house might pass through a gate into a street and still remain inside a web of memory. Someone had seen him carrying jars. Someone had seen her accompanying a mistress. Someone knew which household owned the young man with the scar. Someone knew which woman served the wealthy family near the fountain. Rural estates presented another trap. They offered distance from city crowds, but distance could become isolation. Fields stretched wide under hard light. Vineyards, olive groves, barns, animal pens, threshing floors, and storage pits required constant labour. The estate was a world unto itself, controlled by overseers and rhythms of agricultural necessity. A person who fled from such a place might have fewer immediate witnesses, but also fewer places to disappear. Open country exposed movement. Local villages might be tied to the estate through debt, trade, employment, or fear. A stranger crossing fields at the wrong hour was easily remembered. Workshops created their own captivity. Enslaved artisans could be valuable, and value often brought supervision. Potters, metal workers, weavers, carpenters, dyers, leather workers, bakers, and scribes might labour in spaces where skill was prized, but where tools, material, and products belonged to the owner. Their hands possessed knowledge. Their lives did not possess freedom, because their work generated income. Their absence could be treated as financial injury. A missing skilled worker might trigger a determined pursuit. For domestic servants, intimacy with a master's family did not guarantee safety. It could deepen dependency. A nurse might love the child she raised, yet that bond could hold her in place. A tutor might shape the mind of a young aristocrat, yet remain vulnerable to sale. A personal attendant might know the secrets of a mistress or master, yet knowledge could become dangerous rather than protective. The closer an enslaved person stood to private life, the more carefully he or she might be watched. The household also controlled time. Free people could waste time, visit friends, linger in public places, attend festivals, drink with companions, or rest without giving a full account to an owner. Enslaved people often could not. Their hours belonged to someone else. Even pauses might be noticed. Why were you away so long? Who were you speaking with? Why is the jar not full? Why is the child still crying? Why is the wool unfinished? Why is the lamp empty? Time itself became a leash. Festivals offered brief openings, but also danger. During religious celebrations, cities filled with noise, music, sacrifice, procession, wine, smoke, and crowds. Boundaries softened. Masters were distracted. Masks, travel, and public confusion might give the desperate a chance. Yet festivals also brought more eyes into the streets. More guards near temples. More drunk tongues eager for reward. More strangers ready to exploit vulnerability. Sacred days could promise escape, then deliver capture. Household religion could bind as well as console. Enslaved people participated in rituals, offerings, mourning, purification, and family cults. They might pray to household gods, city gods, ancestral powers, or deities brought in memory from distant homelands. Religion gave language to suffering, but it could also reinforce order. Masters might present hierarchy as divinely sanctioned. Obedience could be wrapped in ritual. Still, hidden beneath formal worship, enslaved people may have carried private vows known only to themselves, prayers for deliverance spoken under the breath while grinding grain or washing stone floors. Children in the household absorbed everything. They saw who commanded and who obeyed. They learned names, tones, gestures, permissions, punishments. A child born free might grow into mastery by watching adults exercise power. A child born enslaved might learn survival through silence. The household reproduced slavery not only through law, but through habit. It taught the next generation what captivity should look like before anyone explained it. And because the household was intimate, punishment was personal. A failed task, a broken cup, a missing coin, a delayed errand, a suspected lie, a forbidden conversation, all could become grounds for discipline. The fear of punishment did not appear only at moments of violence. It lived in anticipation. It shaped posture, voice, and movement. It made people calculate every expression. That calculation consumed strength that might otherwise have been used for planning flight. Escape from such a place required more than an open door. It required breaking through routines, relationships, architecture, hierarchy, time, memory, and fear. The enslaved person had to become invisible inside a world that knew his usefulness. He had to create absence without immediate alarm. She had to gather knowledge without awakening suspicion. They had to decide whom to trust in a place designed to make trust dangerous. Still secrets formed, a scrap of food hidden, a path observed, a loose hinge remembered, a festival date counted, a sympathetic porter tested with a harmless question, a coin saved from an errand, a garment borrowed, stolen, or slowly assembled, a lie practiced until the tongue could carry it calmly. These were not small things. They were the architecture of hope. The watchful household could trap the body, but it could not fully govern imagination. In the deepest hours, when the last lamp smoked and the courtyard stones cooled under the stars, someone may have lain awake listening to the breathing of others and measuring the distance to the gate, not in miles, not yet, but in sounds. One cough from the overseer, 2 steps to the storage room, 3 heartbeats before the dog lifts its head. The entire house became a map, and the first border of freedom was the threshold. Not every chain was made of iron. Some were made of hunger. Some were made of children sleeping in another room. Some were made of memory, debt, shame, language, fear, and the slow exhaustion of a life in which every choice had already been narrowed by someone else. Ancient slavery endured because it reached beyond the wrist and ankle. It entered the stomach. It entered the mind. It entered the bonds between people, twisting love into a mechanism of control. The most immediate of these unseen chains was food. A person who depends on another for bread cannot easily flee from that person's power. In the ancient world, food was not guaranteed by abundance. Harvests failed, storehouses emptied, droughts came, locusts came, armies trampled fields, taxes drained villages. Grain prices rose in cities where the poor already lived close to the edge. For the enslaved, the ration was both sustenance and restraint. It kept the body alive enough to work and dependent enough to remain. A runaway did not carry a harvest on his back. A woman fleeing at night could not bring jars of oil, sacks of barley, dried figs, cheese, water, bedding, and spare sandals without slowing herself and drawing attention. Every item needed for survival became a burden. Every missing item became a future danger. Hunger was patient. It did not seize the fugitive at once. It waited until the 2nd day, the 3rd day, the 4th, when courage had already spent itself and the body began to speak more loudly than hope. Thirst was worse. A person may endure hunger with pain, but thirst commands obedience. It drives the fugitive toward wells, streams, farms, fountains, and settlements, all places where questions live. Who are you? Why are you alone? Why do you look frightened? Why do you not know the road? The need for water could drag a hidden person back into visibility. In this way, nature became an informant. Another invisible chain was family. To enslave one person was often to hold many hearts. A mother might dream of escape, yet remain because her child slept under the same roof and could not travel quietly. A father might endure humiliation because a failed flight could bring punishment on a wife, a daughter, or a son. Brothers and sisters might be separated by sale, but where bonds remained, they could become both strength and trap. Love gave courage, but love also gave the master leverage. Ancient owners understood this, whether they spoke of it openly or not. A person with loved ones nearby could be controlled through threat. Do not run, or the child will be sold. Do not resist, or the woman will be beaten. Do not steal food, or the old man will suffer. Even when such threats were not spoken, they existed in the imagination of the enslaved. Fear did not require constant announcement. It only needed to be believable. Family separation also made escape harder in another way. Those who had already lost kin might lose the networks that make survival possible. In many ancient societies, identity and safety depended upon belonging. A household, clan, village, patron, guild, or temple community gave a person recognition. Without kin, a fugitive entered the world as a loose thread. No one had reason to claim him. No one had inherited obligation to protect her. No grandmother waited with food. No cousin knew a hidden path. No uncle could speak for the stranger at the village gate. Loneliness was therefore not merely sadness. It was danger. Language could also become a chain. Many enslaved people had been transported across regions where their native speech held little value. To be unable to explain oneself is a form of captivity. A fugitive might know the language of commands inside a household, yet not enough to improvise a convincing story at a checkpoint, market, or roadside shrine. Mispronounced words could betray origin. Silence could invite suspicion. Speech could become a trap laid inside the mouth. Names, too, were dangerous. An enslaved person might be renamed by an owner, stripped of the sound once spoken by parents, kin, or a lost community. The new name could be a label of possession, origin, physical trait, or household convenience. To use the old name might expose memory. To use the new name might preserve captivity. To invent another name required confidence and practice. Every answer to a stranger carried risk. Then there was the chain of skill. It may seem strange to call skill a chain, for skill can bring value, pride, and possibility. Yet in slavery, usefulness could become confinement. A gifted metalworker, cook, accountant, musician, nurse, weaver, tutor, horse trainer, or physician might be too valuable to neglect. The owner had reason to guard the person closely. Specialized skill tied the enslaved person to tools, clients, workshops, household routines, and reputation. A master might boast of such a person, hire him out, profit from her labor, or use the promise of eventual manumission as a leash. Hope itself could be weaponized. Some enslaved people were told that obedience might one day bring freedom. Work hard enough, save enough, please the master, serve the household faithfully, avoid trouble, accept insult, endure. Perhaps, one day, the door will open not through flight, but permission. Such promises could be real in certain cases. Manumission did happen. Some freed people built meaningful lives. Some acquired wealth, families, influence, and status beyond the condition into which they had been forced. Yet the possibility of lawful release could also discourage rebellion or escape. A person who has almost saved enough money may not risk everything by running. A person favoured by a master may fear losing a fragile chance. A person told to wait may spend years waiting while youth drains away. The most refined systems of domination are those that teach the captive to supervise himself. Fear of punishment begins outside the body, but in time it may settle within. The enslaved person learns which questions not to ask, which paths not to take, which expressions to hide, which dreams to silence in daylight. The master no longer needs to speak every command. The memory of commands does the work. This does not mean the enslaved accepted their condition. It means survival required mental discipline of a painful kind. Open defiance could bring immediate ruin. Private resistance could preserve the self. A person might appear obedient while quietly measuring opportunities. Such divided existence demanded immense intelligence. To live under slavery was to read moods, predict danger, conceal anger, manage despair, and protect small spaces of inward freedom. Shame formed another chain, though it belonged more properly to the society that imposed it than to the person forced to bear it. Ancient cultures often attached dishonor to servile status. The enslaved were mocked, stereotyped, or treated as morally lesser because they lacked power, as though powerlessness itself proved inferiority. This cruel reversal blamed the captive for captivity. It made the enslaved person carry social stigma added to physical exploitation. For a runaway, stigma could be deadly. People might assume the fugitive was dishonest, dangerous, ungrateful, criminal, or naturally servile. Such assumptions made it easier to refuse aid. The fugitive did not enter a neutral world. He entered a world already filled with stories about people like him, stories invented by those who benefited from his bondage. Dependence on small possessions also mattered. A cloak, a knife, a pair of sandals, a water jar, a hidden coin, a charm from home, a scrap of cloth tied around the wrist. These could mean survival. Yet enslaved people often owned little securely. To flee without supplies was perilous. To gather supplies was suspicious. To steal supplies added accusations that justified harsher punishment. Even the simplest tools of travel were not simple. The body itself could be conditioned into captivity by exhaustion. A person worked beyond strength cannot plan clearly. Sleep deprivation, undernourishment, pain, pregnancy, illness, injury, and grief all narrow the horizon of possible action. Escape requires timing, memory, risk assessment, physical endurance, and emotional force. Slavery deliberately consumed these resources. It kept people busy surviving the day, leaving little strength for the impossible geometry of flight. And yet the inner life persisted. A lullaby remembered from childhood, a forbidden word whispered to a child, a prayer spoken while kneading bread, a joke exchanged in the shadows, a glance of solidarity across a courtyard, a tiny hidden store of grain, a story of someone who had run and not been found. These were not escapes in the physical sense, but they kept alive the idea that the enslaved person was more than the master's definition. Ancient slavery tried to make captivity seem total. It sought to bind appetite, affection, language, time, reputation, and imagination. But no system, however brutal, could fully extinguish the human capacity to know injustice. The invisible chains were powerful precisely because the enslaved still had minds to torment, loves to threaten, memories to exploit, and hopes to manipulate. The tragedy is that many remained not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not feed a child, cross a desert, create witnesses, speak a foreign tongue, heal a wounded foot, or shield the innocent from reprisal. The decision not to run may have been an act of terror, but it may also have been an act of protection, calculation, or love. Still, in the hidden chambers of the mind, some counted days, some listened for weakness in the household, some watched the roads, some studied the habits of guards, traders, boatmen, and shepherds. Some waited not for certainty, because certainty never came, but for a narrow crack in the world. And when that crack appeared, even the invisible chains had to face the oldest truth of all. A person may be owned by law, watched by society, starved by circumstance, and threatened through love, yet still carry within the quiet, dangerous knowledge that life was meant to be one's own. The runaway became a public story, The moment an enslaved person disappeared, the private violence of ownership often spilled into the streets, markets, harbours, workshops, crossroads, and taverns. A missing body was not treated merely as an absence. It was treated as a wound in the master's property, a threat to household order, a challenge to authority, and sometimes a warning sign that others might follow. The search began not only with footsteps, but with words. A name was spoken aloud. A description was repeated. A reward was offered. A face, a scar, an accent, a limp, a trade, a garment, a manner of speech, a known companion, a likely destination. All could become weapons in the hunt. The fugitive's identity, already stolen by slavery, was now turned outward into a net. Details that once belonged to the intimate life of the person became public clues. The world was asked to look, to listen, to suspect. In ancient cities, announcements could travel quickly. Notices might be posted, proclaimed, carried by messengers, or spread by rumour. Markets were especially powerful places for such information. A vegetable seller, a porter, a bath attendant, a sailor, a cook, a prostitute, a beggar, a money changer, a stable hand, and a guard could each hear a fragment. In a world without printed newspapers for the common crowd, the human voice was its own archive. News moved through mouths. A runaway notice did not need poetry. It needed recognition. The words might describe height, age, clothing, skin, hair, scars, origin, profession, and suspected direction. Sometimes the notice promised payment to whoever returned the fugitive. Money sharpened memory. People who might otherwise ignore a stranger suddenly looked twice. A reward transformed the road into a marketplace of suspicion. This was one reason escape was so difficult. The fugitive was not only pursued by the master's household, he or she could be pursued by poverty. A poor free person, hungry and burdened by debts, might see the reward as survival. A guard might see it as duty and profit. A traveller might see it as opportunity. Even someone who felt pity might fear punishment for helping. The structure of a reward turned strangers into hunters. Slave catchers, informers, and professional pursuers occupied the darker edge of this world. Their exact forms differed across societies, but the function was ancient and brutal. When property ran, someone could be paid to retrieve it. Such people knew roads, hiding places, markets, ferries, border zones, and the habits of desperate fugitives. They understood that hunger drives people to food, thirst to water, loneliness to familiar tongues, and fear to darkness. They did not need to be noble. They only needed to be patient. The runaway, by contrast, had to keep moving without becoming memorable. This was almost impossible. To ask for water was memorable. To refuse speech was memorable. To walk too fast was memorable. To linger was memorable. To look frightened was memorable. To look too calm could also be memorable. Every performance of ordinary life had to be perfect, and perfection is difficult when the heart is beating like a drum beneath the ribs. Branding made the hunt easier in some places. A mark burned into flesh could identify status, punishment, or ownership. Such practices varied, and not every enslaved person carried a visible brand. Yet where branding existed, it was meant to make the body readable. The mark said that the person had already been judged, claimed, disciplined, or warned. A fugitive with such a mark had to hide it with cloth, hair, posture, darkness, or deception. But wounds have their own memory. Cloth slips. Weather changes, work exposes the skin. A curious eye can become a sentence. Collars performed a similar function with terrible clarity. An iron band around the neck could carry an inscription that commanded return. The fugitive wearing such a thing was forced to carry the master's message into every encounter. The collar spoke when the person remained silent. It reduced identity to capture instructions. It made the throat, the passage of breath and speech, into a signboard of bondage. Some enslaved people tried to remove such marks or devices, but removal required tools, time, assistance, and pain. A broken collar might leave evidence. A burned brand might be scarred over, cut, or hidden, yet the attempt itself could be recognized. To alter the body in search of freedom was an act of desperate courage, but also a new risk. The body, wounded by slavery, could be wounded again by escape. Descriptions could be more dangerous than objects. An accent from Syria, a hairstyle from North Africa, a tattoo from Thrace, a scar across the cheek, a missing finger, a skilled way of handling horses, a habit of speaking with bowed head. All could identify a person even without chains. Ancient societies were deeply attentive to visible difference. Clothing, gesture, complexion, dialect, and bearing placed people within imagined categories. The fugitive had to pass through these categories without being caught by them. The search also moved through official channels. Local authorities might be asked to assist. Gatekeepers might be warned. Harbour officials might notice passengers. Soldiers might question travellers. Estate managers might alert neighbouring farms. Temples, inns, and marketplaces could become listening posts. The fugitive's route narrowed as word spread. What had seemed like a wide world became a series of closing doors. A particularly cruel feature of the hunt was the use of other enslaved people as sources of information. Companions might be interrogated, family members might be threatened, fellow workers might be promised reward or relief, someone might be beaten until a name, plan, or destination came out. Thus the runaway's courage could endanger those left behind. This knowledge haunted every plan. To flee was to gamble not only with one's own life, but with the bodies of others. For this reason, some escapes were solitary by necessity. The fewer who knew, the safer the secret. Yet solitude made survival harder. A companion could watch during sleep, share food, remember directions, carry a child, speak another language, or help invent a story, alone. The fugitive was safer from betrayal but weaker against the world. Together, fugitives were stronger but more visible. Two strangers draw more attention than one. A group draws still more. The mathematics of escape were merciless. Children made flight even more dangerous. A crying infant could reveal a hiding place. A tired child could not walk far. A hungry child could not be persuaded by strategy. Yet to leave a child behind could be unbearable. Ancient records rarely preserve the full emotional weight of such decisions, but silence does not make them small. Somewhere in the lost darkness of history, parents surely stood at thresholds, listening to sleeping children, torn between the dream of freedom and the terror of abandonment. False refuge was another danger. A fugitive might seek help from someone who appeared sympathetic, only to be detained and returned. The promise of shelter could be bait. A cheap meal could become a trap. A boatman might agree to passage, then alert the owner. A farmer might offer work, then demand proof of status. Trust was necessary for survival, yet trust could destroy. Slavery made suspicion rational. Temples sometimes appeared as spaces of appeal, but sacred ground did not automatically dissolve ownership. A runaway might cling to an altar, hoping divine presence would restrain human violence. In some places and moments, sanctuary could create negotiation, delay, or public scrutiny. Yet the sacred was not always stronger than property. Priests, officials, and masters could interpret ritual obligations in ways that restored order rather than freedom. The fugitive might gain time, not safety. The reward system also changed the emotional landscape of a community. It asked people to value capture more than mercy. It trained the eye to see profit in fear. Imagine a runaway entering a village at evening, when smoke rises from cooking fires and goats move toward pens. The fugitive sees warmth, water, bread, and human voices. Yet behind each doorway may stand a person who has heard of the reward. The village is not merely a place. It is a question. Will anyone choose compassion over gain? Some did. History is not without hidden kindness. People sheltered fugitives, lied for them, guided them through fields, shared food, concealed children, or looked away at the necessary moment. But such acts were dangerous precisely because the system was built to punish them. A person who helped a runaway challenged property, hierarchy, and sometimes state authority. Mercy had to move quietly. Capture was often staged as restoration. The master regained possession. The household recovered order. The community saw authority reaffirmed. But from the fugitive's perspective, capture was a return to danger intensified by humiliation. Punishment might follow, not only to discipline the individual but to teach others. The body of the captured runaway could become a message. The lesson was meant to be read by everyone. This is why the hunt mattered so much. It was not only about retrieving labour, it was about preserving the imagination of control. If one person fled successfully, others might believe the world had openings. If many ran, the confidence of masters could tremble. Every returned fugitive repaired the illusion that slavery was permanent, natural, and inescapable. Yet the repeated need for notices, rewards, collars, and punishments reveals the opposite truth. Enslaved people did run. They ran often enough that societies developed tools to find them. Every runaway notice is proof of refusal. Every reward is proof that ownership was contested. Every collar speaks not only of domination, but of the fact that someone had once tried to leave. Still, for the person on the road, such historical meaning offered little comfort. The danger was immediate. A barking dog, a hand on the shoulder, a stranger staring too long, a gate closed for the night, a rumour arriving before the fugitive, a coin offered for capture. In that world, escape was not a single bold act. It was 1,000 moments of not being seen. Under the vast ancient sky, the runaway moved through a civilization trained to notice absence. The moon lit the road, the wells waited, the towns listened. Somewhere behind, a master named a price. Somewhere ahead, a stranger decided whether to ask a question. And between them walked a human being carrying the most forbidden possession of all, the will to belong to no one. Empire made captivity portable. In a small village, an enslaved person might know every face, every path, every family quarrel, every hidden hollow between fields. Escape could mean slipping beyond the edge of a local world. But empires changed the scale of bondage. They stretched authority across provinces, roads, rivers, ports, fortresses, tax districts, military camps, and cities swollen with strangers. They created vastness, yet also connected that vastness through systems of control. In such a world, distance did not always weaken the master. Sometimes it strengthened him. The great empires of antiquity learned how to move people as they moved grain, silver, timber, soldiers, stone, and messages. Captives taken in war could be transported far from their homelands. Labourers could be reassigned to royal projects. Skilled workers could be gathered at capitals. Women and children could be absorbed into elite households. Men condemned to forced labour could be sent where the state required bodies most urgently. Empire did not merely conquer territory, it rearranged human lives. Egypt offers one image of this power. Rising along the Nile beneath a sky of fierce blue light, the river carried boats heavy with stone, grain, officials, soldiers, and workers. The state could summon labour on a scale that still astonishes the modern imagination. Not all forced labour in Egypt was slavery in a simple sense, for ancient labour obligations were varied and complex, yet foreign captives, household slaves, and dependent workers existed within a world where royal authority could command bodies for temples, estates, and service. The landscape itself seemed organised by the rhythm of command, from mud-brick villages to monumental sanctuaries where carved kings smote enemies before the gods. In Mesopotamia, where rivers cut through flatlands and cities rose from baked earth, records became instruments of power. Clay tablets could preserve debts, transfers, rations, purchases, inheritances, and labour obligations. A human life could be tracked through marks pressed by a reed stylus while the clay was still soft. There is something haunting about this administrative calm. The tablet does not weep, it does not rage, it lists, it counts. It fixes a person inside an economy of ownership and dependence. For the fugitive, such record-keeping meant that absence could be named, valued, and pursued. Persian imperial rule stretched over an immense and varied world, from highlands to river valleys, from royal roads to border satrapies. Its genius lay partly in organisation, tribute, local elites, garrisons, messengers, and administrative centres allowed authority to operate across staggering distances. Within such a structure, captives and dependent labourers could be drawn into royal and elite projects. The empire contained many peoples, languages, and customs, and this diversity could appear to offer hiding places. Yet diversity also meant that strangers were constantly categorised. Officials asked who belonged where, who owed what, who travelled under whose protection, and who could be taxed or commanded. The Greek world presents a different pattern, fractured among cities yet tied by trade, warfare, colonisation, and shared cultural practices. In some city-states, slavery became deeply embedded in domestic life, agriculture, mining, and craft production. Athens, praised for drama, philosophy, and political debate, relied heavily on enslaved labour. This contradiction is one of history's sharpest stones. The same society that asked profound questions about justice could deny full humanity to those who cooked its meals, carried its water, worked its silver mines, and accompanied its citizens through the streets. The Greek polis was intimate. Citizenship was powerful because it was limited. To belong fully was to be known through ancestry, household, male status, property, military service, and public recognition. The enslaved person stood outside that circle. Escape into such a world required more than physical absence from the owner. It required crossing into a community that guarded membership closely. A fugitive could not easily claim citizenship. He could not simply appear in the assembly or inherit a lineage. The social body of the city had boundaries as real as its walls. Rome carried the imperial logic of slavery to a scale that chilled even its own moralists at times. Conquest flooded the Roman world with captives. Estates, mines, households, shops, ships, farms, schools, and public works drew upon enslaved labour. The roads of Rome are often celebrated as marvels of engineering, and rightly so. They bound distant provinces to the heart of power. But the same roads that carried legions and merchants also aided pursuit. A runaway could travel farther than in a disconnected world, but so could news, orders, and men sent to retrieve him. Roman law gave ownership a terrifying reach. A master's claim was recognised across wide territories. Markets in different cities could absorb enslaved people from many origins, making the human body part of an imperial economy. A person captured in Gaul might labour in Italy. A Greek tutor might serve a Roman household. A Syrian cook might work beside a North African groom. A child born in an urban home might know no homeland beyond the master's walls. Empire made the enslaved both uprooted and useful. Yet imperial scale also produced contradictions. Cities were crowded, ports were chaotic, armies needed followers. Frontier regions could be porous. Freed people, migrants, sailors, traders, soldiers, entertainers, and beggars moved through urban spaces. In such complexity, a fugitive might find shadows. A person could blend into dock labour, attach himself to a travelling group, hide among the poor, or vanish into the anonymous hunger of a capital. But anonymity was unstable. To survive, one still needed work, shelter, protection, and a story. Empires also created official violence that discouraged flight. Garrisons stood along roads and frontiers. Patrols protected estates, mines, and tax routes. Governors and local elites cooperated when property and order were at stake. A fugitive who crossed a provincial boundary might not cross beyond the logic of slavery. The next district might honour the owner's claim. The next city might have its own slave market. The next army might seize the stranger as a camp servant, labourer, or suspect. This is the dreadful paradox. The larger the empire, the more possible it seemed to disappear, and the more systems existed to prevent disappearance from becoming freedom. Imperial worlds contained hidden corners, but also formal procedures. They contained crowds, but also informers. They contained roads, but also checkpoints. They contained diversity, but also suspicion of those without patrons or papers. To be unclaimed could be nearly as dangerous as being claimed. The imperial economy depended upon making people legible. Who pays tax? Who owes labour? Who serves in the army? Who belongs to which household? Who has the right to trade? Who may cross a border? Who may own land? Who may bear witness? The enslaved fugitive tried to become illegible, to slip from the lines of the record. But empire was a great machine for writing people back into place. Still, domination was never perfect. Dust storms swallowed tracks, ports confused identities, war disrupted records, fires destroyed archives, corrupt officials accepted bribes, sympathetic strangers lied, border peoples ignored imperial claims. The vastness of empire could be a net, but nets have holes. Some runaways found them. Most names are lost. In the end, empire turned slavery into a system larger than any one household. It made ownership travel by law, habit, road, record, and force. It gave masters confidence that the world beyond the gate still belonged, in some measure, to them. Yet every fugitive who stepped into that world tested the empire's boast. Beneath the sandals of the runaway, the roads of power became something else for a moment. Not instruments of control, but narrow paths of forbidden hope. Labour could become a prison more complete than stone. In the ancient world, work was not merely the use of the body, it was a way of arranging power. It taught people where to stand, when to rise, how to breathe, how much pain to hide, and how little of the day belonged to them. For the enslaved, labour was not a contract freely entered. It was command made physical. It entered the muscles, the joints, the lungs, the spine, the hands, and the face. It shaped the body until even rest felt borrowed. Nowhere was this more terrible than in the mines. Imagine descending before sunrise into a world where the earth itself seems hostile. The air is narrow. The lamps smoke. Dust coats the tongue. Stone sweats cold in the darkness, while above ground the day moves on without those buried beneath it, in mines of silver, copper, gold, lead, and other metals. Enslaved workers and condemned labourers could be driven into conditions that consumed them rapidly. The purpose of the mine was not human endurance, it was extraction. The body was a tool placed against the mountain until one of them broke. In deep shafts and cramped galleries, escape was nearly impossible because the worksite itself was a trap. Entrances could be guarded. Workers emerged exhausted, coated in dirt, marked by the labour they performed. Food, tools, lamps, and movement were controlled. The surrounding landscape might be remote, barren, or militarized. A person fleeing from such a place would carry visible signs of origin, injuries from toil, and the weakness that comes from darkness, dust, and hunger. The mine did not merely imprison, it devoured the strength needed to run. Quarries held another kind of brutality. There, under open sky, workers cut the bones of the earth. Limestone, marble, basalt, granite, and sandstone did not yield gently. Blocks had to be marked, struck, wedged, levered, dragged, and shaped. The sound of quarry labour was a world of impact. hammer on chisel, wedge and crack, rope tightening, overseer shouting, dust blown across sweating skin. The sun made stone glare white, hands split, shoulders tore, knees stiffened. The body became part of an immense mechanical effort, often far from the softness of city life that the stone would later decorate. The great monuments of antiquity can inspire awe, and they should. But awe must be honest. Behind many ancient building projects lay complex labour systems, including paid labour, seasonal obligation, corvée service, skilled craftsmanship, and sometimes enslaved or coerced bodies. The old stones do not tell one simple story. Stratigraphic excavation can reveal worker settlements, tool marks, food remains, ramps, workshops, and logistics. Lithic analysis can show the quarry source of a block and the methods used to shape it. Such evidence reminds us that monumentality was never abstract. It was organised through human backs. Agricultural labour was less dramatic than mining, but it was often more constant. Fields demanded obedience to seasons. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, irrigation, harvesting, threshing, pressing, pruning, tending animals, repairing walls, carrying loads, cleaning ditches, and guarding crops filled the year. On large estates, enslaved workers might rise in darkness and move under supervision through repetitive tasks that left little time for thought beyond survival. The land itself became a schedule imposed on the body. Harvest was especially difficult. Grain had to be cut before weather ruined it. Grapes had to be gathered when ripe. Olives required beating, collecting, pressing, and storing. Dates, figs, flax, sesame, barley, wheat, and countless local crops each demanded their own discipline. During peak seasons, labour could intensify until exhaustion blurred the days. To escape during such times might seem tempting because everyone was busy. Yet the same urgency meant supervisors counted workers closely. A missing body was lost productivity at the very moment owners cared most. In irrigated landscapes, water added another layer of control. Canals, dikes, basins, and sluices required maintenance. The person who controlled water controlled life. Enslaved labourers working irrigation systems lived within an economy where every task mattered to crop survival. These places were watched because neglect threatened wealth. The mud, the reeds, the mosquitoes, the heavy baskets of silt, the long hours beneath heat, all joined in the discipline of the field. Domestic labour, though often hidden from grand histories of production, could be relentless. Grinding grain by hand was punishing work. The circular motion of stone against stone entered wrists, elbows, shoulders, and back. Water carrying bent the spine. Washing cloth abraded hands. Cooking over smoke stung the eyes and lungs. Childcare demanded constant attention. Cleaning did not end because dust returned. Fires died, lamps emptied, and people ate again. The house consumed labour the way a hearth consumes fuel. Workshops turned skill into repetition. Weaving, spinning, dyeing, pottery, brickmaking, tanning, metalwork, baking, carpentry, and glass production could require long hours in heat, smell, noise, and cramped spaces. Dye workshops might stink of urine, mordants and boiling vats. Tanneries reeked of hides and decay. Potteries glowed with kiln heat. Bakeries filled the lungs with flour dust and smoke. Skilled labour did not mean gentle labour. It meant the owner could extract value from technique. Ships created another floating prison. Enslaved people served aboard vessels in varied roles, from general labour to rowing in particular contexts, from cargo handling to cooking, maintenance and port work. The sea narrowed every possibility. A ship had no alley into which one could vanish. The horizon was beautiful and useless. Water surrounded the fugitive, but not drinkable water. The captain commanded a small world of ropes, sail, cargo, and discipline. To rebel at sea was to risk drowning, violence, or abandonment on an unknown coast. Construction labour displayed power in public. City walls, roads, aqueducts, temples, palaces, tombs, fortresses, and harbours required earth-moving, hauling, brick-making, timber-cutting, mortar-mixing, stone-dressing, lifting, and endless transport. Such works depended not only on strength but coordination. A single stone block might require teams, ropes, sledges, rollers, ramps, animals, overseers, engineers, and precise timing. The workers' individuality disappeared into collective force. The monument rose, and the labourer's name vanished. Exhaustion was not accidental, it served control. A person worked to the edge of collapse has less strength to flee. A person whose feet are blistered cannot walk far. A person whose back is injured cannot climb. A person whose lungs are ruined by dust cannot run through hills. A person who sleeps only from utter depletion cannot spend the night preparing secret plans. Labour did what walls could not do. It made the body carry captivity within itself. Ancient owners also used labour placement strategically. Dangerous, remote, and degrading tasks could be punishment. A household servant who angered a master might be sent to harder field work. A troublesome worker might be sold to the mines. The threat of being moved from a bearable form of bondage to a lethal one could restrain resistance. This made different kinds of labour part of a single system of fear. The enslaved person did not merely ask, "Can I endure today?" He or she also had to ask, "What worse place could I be sent to tomorrow?" The rhythm of work isolated people from opportunity. Many escapes require planning, but labour consumes attention. When the mind is fixed on lifting, cutting, carrying, grinding, pulling, digging, tending, and surviving the overseer's eye, the future shrinks. The next meal becomes the horizon. The next rest becomes the dream. The next blow avoided becomes victory. Slavery used this narrowing of time to its advantage, yet labour also created knowledge. The enslaved knew the land through their feet and hands. Field workers knew paths between farms. Water carriers knew wells and fountains. Stable workers knew animals and roads. Port labourers knew ships and schedules. Domestic servants knew household routines. Quarry workers knew the weak points in stone and perhaps the weak points in supervision. Artisans knew clients, materials, and markets. The same labour that controlled them sometimes taught them the geography of escape. A groom might know which horse was fastest and which gate was least guarded at dawn. A cook might know when guests distracted the household. A porter might know which merchant asked few questions. A field hand might know where reeds grew thick beside a canal. A sailor might know which ship departed with the tide. The master saw labour as use. The enslaved could transform labour into intelligence. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of ancient bondage. The system required enslaved people to understand the world in detail, then feared what such understanding might make possible. Those who cleaned rooms heard secrets. Those who carried goods learned routes. Those who served wine listened to political talk. Those who worked estates learned storage patterns. Those who tended animals learned movement. Control depended on competence, and competence could become dangerous. Still, the cost was immense. Bones remember labour. Archaeologists reading ancient skeletons can sometimes identify repetitive strain, joint damage, trauma, nutritional stress, and the heavy signature of hard work. Such bodies do not speak in words, yet they testify. They reveal lives bent by task after task, season after season, order after order. Many belong to people whose names were never written with honour, but whose labour built the visible ancient world. When night came to the labouring enslaved, it did not always bring dreams. Sometimes it brought only collapse. The body lay down not in peace, but in temporary surrender. Hands throbbed. Dust settled in the hair. Smoke remained in the throat. The mind drifted between pain and sleep. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay roads, rivers, mountains, and cities. But the distance from pallet to doorway could feel as great as the distance from Earth to stars. This was why labour itself made escape nearly impossible. It did not only occupy the day, it spent the person. It taxed every movement before the fugitive could make the first forbidden step. It built monuments while breaking bodies, filled storehouses while emptying lives, and turned the sun's passage into a measure of endurance. And yet, beneath the weight of stone, grain, water, fire, and command, the thought of freedom did not die. It may have moved slowly, like a coal buried under ash. It may have waited through years of aching dawns. It may have hidden inside knowledge gathered from work itself. For even in the mine, the field, the kitchen, the quarry, the workshop, and the ship, the enslaved person remained more than labour. He remained a mind watching. She remained a soul measuring. They remained human beings listening for the hour when exhaustion might meet opportunity, and the world might open by the width of a single unguarded door. Punishment was the shadow at the edge of every thought. It did not need to fall every day. It only needed to be remembered. A scar across the back, a missing tooth, a limp from an old beating, a story whispered beside the grinding stone, a cry heard once from the courtyard. These things could discipline a household for years. Ancient slavery did not depend on constant violence alone. It depended on the expectation of violence, the knowledge that pain waited behind disobedience like a door already open. Fear began in uncertainty. The enslaved person often did not know what action would provoke wrath. A broken cup might be forgiven one day and punished the next. A delayed errand might be ignored by a gentle mood or answered by a blow in a cruel one. A master drunk with wine might become dangerous in ways no rule could predict. An overseer embarrassed before guests might punish the nearest servant to restore authority. This uncertainty made fear spread beyond specific laws. It made the entire atmosphere unstable. The body became the place where power wrote its warnings. Whipping was among the most common terrors. It was direct, public, and meant to degrade as well as injure. A whip could punish theft, lateness, suspected lying, attempted flight, poor work, disrespect, or simply the anger of the owner. The pain was physical, but the message was social. It announced who had the right to strike and who could be struck. It reminded every witness that the enslaved body was not protected in the same way as the body of the free. Mutilation carried an even darker purpose: to cut, brand, disfigure, or permanently mark a person was to make punishment endure beyond the moment. Such acts could serve as warnings against theft, rebellion, or escape. A damaged body became evidence, stigma, and restraint. It told strangers that the person had been punished. It told the person that the past could not easily be hidden. In societies where appearance shaped trust and status, visible injury could reduce the chance of successful flight. Punishment followed the fugitive into every mirror of human attention. Imprisonment also existed, though not always in forms familiar to modern imagination. Holding cells, locked rooms, workhouses, pits, storerooms, chains, and guarded quarters could be used to restrict movement. But for the enslaved, confinement did not always require a separate prison. The estate, mine, ship, kitchen, or workshop could become enough. A person might be locked at night, chained during transport, restrained after suspicion, or confined while awaiting sale. The purpose was not rehabilitation, it was control. Sale itself was punishment. To be sold away from a household, even a harsh one, meant violent uncertainty. The new owner might be crueler. The new labour might be deadlier. The new region might be farther from kin. A child might be torn from a mother, a husband from a wife, a friend from the only person who remembered his old name. The threat of sale required no whip in the moment it was spoken. It worked through imagination. It forced the enslaved to picture a future worse than the present, and to obey in order to avoid it. The mines stood in the mind as a place of dread. So did the fields of brutal estates, the quarries, the ships, the brothels, the punishment gangs, the remote frontiers where survival was thin. A master did not need to describe every horror. Reputation did the work. Everyone knew there were places from which people didn't return, or returned broken beyond recognition. The geography of punishment was part of slavery's mental map. For those who attempted escape, punishment could be spectacular. The captured runaway might be beaten publicly, branded, collared, chained, sold, or assigned to harsher labour. The point was not only to make the individual suffer, the point was to make the suffering useful. The body of the runaway became a warning posted in flesh. Look, the system said, this is what happens when a person forgets his place. Collective punishment deepened the terror. If one person fled, others might be interrogated or harmed. If several conspired, families and companions might suffer. This made every dream of escape morally agonizing. The fugitive had to ask whether his courage would become another person's pain. Such cruelty reached beyond the individual. It turned community into a hostage. In Roman memory, the punishment of rebellion could reach the level of annihilation. Crucifixion, that most public and prolonged form of killing, was reserved for the disgraced, the enslaved, rebels, bandits, and those whom the state wished to display as defeated bodies. It was not merely execution, it was a theatre of domination. The condemned was lifted where all could see, exposed to sun, insects, thirst, mockery, and slow death. Roads became galleries of terror. The message travelled farther than the voice of any magistrate. Other societies had their own forms of exemplary punishment. Impalement, forced labour until death, drowning, burning, beating, starvation, and ritual humiliation appear in various ancient contexts as tools of state and household violence. The forms changed, but the logic endured. Power sought to make disobedience visible and unbearable. The goal was not only to end a life, but to discipline the living. The fear of punishment worked through memory. An enslaved child who saw an adult beaten learned before language fully formed that resistance carried a price. A young worker who heard older servants speak of a runaway branded on the face learned that the road could return as a scar. A woman who saw another sold away after a suspected affair learned that the household could tear apart human ties without warning. Such memories accumulated like ash. They darkened every decision. Punishment could also be disguised as order. Masters and legal authorities often justified violence as discipline, correction, or necessity. They framed cruelty as the maintenance of household peace, economic stability, moral hierarchy, or public security. This language mattered because it allowed societies to tolerate brutality without naming themselves brutal. A beating became discipline, a sale became management, a collar became prevention, a crucifixion became justice. Words softened the conscience of the powerful while leaving the body of the enslaved to bear the truth. There was psychological punishment as well, insults, humiliation, forced nakedness, deprivation of sleep, denial of food, separation from loved ones, public accusations, sexual coercion, threats to children, mockery of origin or speech. These could wound without leaving marks that archaeologists might find. The ancient record often preserves objects better than anguish. Still, silence does not mean absence. Human beings have always understood how to injure one another through shame, yet punishment also revealed a hidden weakness in the system. If slavery were truly accepted by the enslaved, such vast machinery of terror would not have been necessary. The whip, the brand, the collar, the reward, the cross, the chain, the locked gate, All these confess that domination had to be maintained. People resisted, people ran, people lied, stole time, protected one another, broke tools, slowed labour, hid food, carried forbidden memories, and sometimes struck back. Punishment was the answer of power to the persistence of human will. There is a terrible intimacy in this history. It asks us not only to look at empires and laws, but at moments when one person stood over another and chose pain. The ancient world produced beauty that still takes the breath away. Temples at sunrise, marble under moonlight, poems copied by careful hands, cities glowing with lamps beside dark rivers. But beneath that beauty, many lived with the knowledge that their bodies could be hurt for another person's convenience. Why, then, was escape nearly impossible? Because punishment made the future frightening before it arrived. It placed terror ahead of the fugitive on the road and behind him at home. It threatened the runner, the helper, the witness, the family, and the community. It made pain not an accident of capture, but a promised consequence. The enslaved person who considered flight had to imagine not only freedom, but failure. And failure had a smell, a sound, a shape. Leather striking skin, iron closing at the neck, a child crying during sale, a crowd watching death by the roadside. Still, fear never had the final word inside every heart. Some chose the road despite knowing the cost. Some looked upon punishment and saw not the proof of slavery's power, but the evidence of its fear. For no master punishes a stone for wishing to move. No empire crucifies a shadow for dreaming of the hills. Punishment was terrible because the enslaved were alive, thinking, remembering, refusing beings. Their humanity made control necessary, and their humanity made control incomplete. In the ancient night, while the household slept and the last lamp trembled, a person might touch an old scar and still listen for the gate. The memory of pain could silence the body, but somewhere deeper, beneath fear and beneath exhaustion, the thought remained. There may be a road, there may be a hand willing to help, there may be a dawn beyond the reach of the whip, answerless, adrift to ponder. That hope was dangerous, fragile, and profoundly human. Rebellion was the dream that frightened every master. A single runaway challenged ownership. A revolt challenged the world that made ownership possible. It was one thing for one enslaved person to vanish into darkness, carrying hunger and hope along a dangerous road. It was another for many to gather, speak, plan, arm themselves, and declare through action that the order of master and slave could be overturned by force. In the ancient imagination, revolt was nightmare. It turned tools into weapons. It transformed kitchens, fields, mines, barns, ships, and barracks into places of conspiracy. It made the obedient face unreadable. It taught the powerful to fear the silence of those who served them. For if one man at the table pouring wine could hear secrets, and one woman grinding grain could count the rhythms of the household, and one field hand could know where the tools were stored, then power was never as secure as it appeared. The conditions that made escape nearly impossible also made rebellion terrifyingly difficult. Enslaved people were divided by language, origin, skill, gender, age, household, and labour assignment. Some had families they feared to endanger. Some were watched closely. Some lived in cities where armed response could come quickly. Some were isolated in rural estates, distant from allies. Some were exhausted by work. Some hoped for lawful freedom and feared losing it. To rebel required overcoming not only the master, but the careful fragmentation of enslaved life. And yet, revolts happened. They rose most often where suffering was concentrated and where numbers gave courage a body. Mines, large estates, military zones, and regions filled with war captives could become dangerous landscapes for owners. When many enslaved people shared the same harsh conditions, secrecy became easier and anger more collective. In such places, the individual fear of punishment could be absorbed into a larger possibility. Alone, a man might be beaten, Together, 100 men might seize the overseer. Together, 1,000 might become an army. The mines were especially volatile. There, the line between labour and death was thin. Workers underground or in remote extraction zones had little reason to believe patience would bring mercy. The mine consumed bodies so rapidly that rebellion could appear not as madness, but as the last rational act. To die fighting under the open sky might seem preferable to dying slowly beneath stone, dust, and command. Ancient accounts of mine revolts reveal that extreme exploitation could turn despair into organisation. State uprisings followed a similar logic. Large agricultural properties gathered many enslaved labourers under overseers who often ruled through brutality. The countryside could both isolate and empower them. Distance from a city delayed military response. Fields, barns, animals, tools, and local knowledge offered resources. Roads could be blocked, houses could be attacked, mountains, forests, and marshes might provide temporary refuge. What had been a geography of labour could become a theatre of war, but rebellion required weapons, and weapons were carefully controlled. Enslaved people were often surrounded by useful objects: sickles, knives, axes, hammers, stones, poles, ropes, fire, and farm tools. These were not swords in a formal army, yet in desperate hands they could become deadly. The first phase of rebellion might depend on surprise. A guard overpowered at night, a storehouse opened, a household seized during a festival, a convoy attacked on the road. Violence had to be sudden because delay favoured the powerful. The problem came next. A revolt could begin with rage, but it could survive only with food, leadership, direction, and discipline. The newly freed had to decide where to go, whom to trust, whether to flee into rough country, attack nearby estates, negotiate, or build a fortified camp. They had to feed children, the wounded, the old, and the exhausted. They had to manage disputes among people who may have shared suffering but not language or custom. They had to become a society while being hunted. Leadership mattered. In some rebellions, charismatic figures emerged from among gladiators, soldiers, herdsmen, labourers, or skilled men accustomed to command. The ancient world remembered Spartacus because his revolt shook Rome's confidence. A Thracian by origin, trained as a gladiator, he and his companions escaped from a gladiatorial school and gathered a force that grew from fugitives, rural slaves, and the desperate. Their struggle moved through Italy like a storm the Republic could not ignore. For a time, they defeated Roman forces and opened a terrifying question. What if those treated as property could become an army? Yet the story of Spartacus also reveals the terrible limits of rebellion. Courage could win battles, but victory against one army did not dismantle the state. Rome could summon more legions, more commanders, more supplies, more ruthlessness. A slave army had to survive without secure cities, stable supply lines, recognized diplomacy, or broad political legitimacy among the free population. Fear of the rebels could unite even divided elites. The revolt that looked like liberation to the enslaved looked like apocalypse to owners. When rebellion failed, punishment became theatre on an imperial scale. Roads could be lined with the bodies of the defeated. Captives could be executed, sold, tortured, or returned to harsher labour. The state needed more than victory. It needed memory. It needed every surviving enslaved person to hear what had happened. It needed every master to feel reassured. It needed the landscape itself to speak terror. This is why rebellion was both powerful and perilous. It could break the spell of obedience, but it invited the full violence of the world. It required trust among people whom slavery had taught to mistrust. It required weapons from a system that withheld them. It required movement in landscapes watched by officials and soldiers. It required food in economies controlled by owners. It required time, and time was the ally most rarely granted to the enslaved. Some rebellions were smaller and less remembered, a household killing, a shipboard mutiny, a group flight that turned into armed resistance, a mine uprising crushed far from the attention of historians, a field gang refusing orders until force arrived, ancient archives, written mostly by elites, preserved the revolts that frightened the powerful most. Many smaller fires were never recorded, or were recorded only as crimes. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Beneath the official silence, there must have been countless moments when enslaved people tested the strength of command and found it, if only briefly, breakable. Rebellion also lived in rumour. A master did not need actual revolt nearby to fear it. Rumour could travel through baths, markets, taverns, roads, and military camps. There has been an uprising, a villa has burned, a mine has been seized, slaves have fled to the hills. Such stories may have grown in the telling, yet fear made them potent. They reminded the powerful that the enslaved were not tools, but persons capable of coordination, anger, and revenge. For the enslaved, rumours of revolt could carry a different meaning. They said, someone resisted, someone struck back, someone gathered others, someone refused to die quietly, even when crushed. A rebellion could enter memory as proof that the world was not eternal. The master's house could burn, the overseer could run, the gate could open. The impossible had happened somewhere, if only for a little while. And yet many did not rebel, not because they accepted bondage, but because rebellion asked a price almost beyond human measure. It risked children, spouses, elders, companions, and strangers. It risked torture if captured. It risked the transformation of hope into massacre. It required choosing open war against a civilization that possessed trained soldiers, fortified cities, money, horses, iron, law, and the habit of command. The ancient rebel therefore stands before us not as a symbol alone, but as a person carrying impossible weight. He may have been hungry, she may have been grieving, they may have known that victory was unlikely, yet still found a moment when submission became more unbearable than death. In that moment, the enslaved body ceased to be silent property and became a political force. Rebellion did not make escape easy. In many ways, it revealed why escape was so hard. It showed the scale of power required to confront slavery openly. It showed how quickly states could answer with organized violence. It showed how fear of disorder bound free communities to the defense of ownership. But it also showed that slavery was never secure in the deepest sense, because no law could erase the human refusal to be a thing. Under the ancient sun, among mines, estates, training yards, and roads heavy with dust, revolt remained both terror and prophecy. It was the dangerous dream that the many could rise, that the master could tremble, that the world might be remade not by permission, but by hands that had carried its stones for too long. Sanctuary was hope with a locked door. Across the ancient world, desperate people turned towards sacred places when human power became unbearable. Temples, shrines, altars, groves, tombs of heroes, holy precincts, and statues of gods could become places where the hunted reached for protection beyond ordinary law. To touch an altar was to make a claim not only upon people, but upon heaven. It was to say that mortal ownership must answer, if only for a moment, to powers older than kings. For the enslaved fugitive, sanctuary offered a fragile pause, not freedom, not certainty, often not even safety. But pause mattered. A pause could stop a beating. A pause could force negotiation. A pause could bring witnesses. A pause could move suffering from the secrecy of a household into the public gaze. In a world where violence could happen behind doors, sacred space sometimes gave the enslaved person a stage upon which to be seen. Imagine a slave fleeing through a city at dawn, breath torn by fear, sandals slapping stone, voices rising behind. Ahead stands a temple, its steps still cool from the night, its columns pale under the first fire of morning. Incense clings to the air. A priest has not yet completed the first offering. The fugitive climbs, falls, reaches, and grips the altar with both hands. In that instant, the chase changes. The master may still rage, the law may still favour ownership, but the scene has entered the territory of the gods. This was the power of sanctuary. It interrupted the ordinary flow of command, yet sacred protection was never simple. Temples existed inside societies, and societies were shaped by rank, wealth, and property. Priests depended on patrons, sanctuaries owned land, slaves, animals, treasures, and revenues of their own. A temple could defend the weak in one moment and participate in systems of inequality in another. The presence of a god did not automatically make a place merciful. Sacred power could restrain violence, but it could also sanctify order. In some Greek contexts, a slave who sought refuge at an altar might not be simply returned at once. The act could suggest severe mistreatment, creating pressure for sale to another master or some form of settlement. This did not necessarily grant liberty. It could merely transfer ownership. To the fugitive, such a result might still be valuable if the previous household was especially cruel. But it was not the same as becoming free. Sanctuary often negotiated suffering rather than abolishing bondage. This distinction matters deeply. A person modern imagination might picture as saved by the temple may in fact have been redirected into another form of dependency. The sacred precinct might soften the master's hand, but not break the master's claim. It might turn immediate punishment into legal discussion. It might attract witnesses who made murder or public abuse more shameful. But the fugitive remained vulnerable to the values of the community that interpreted the sacred act. In Roman worlds, temples and statues could carry a sense of reverence, yet the machinery of ownership remained powerful. An enslaved person might appeal to religious or legal protections in extreme cases, especially against unbearable cruelty, but the likely outcome depended on period, location, officials, and the social power of the owner. The gods were everywhere invoked, but human institutions decided what invocation meant. This ambiguity made sanctuary a narrow bridge over a deep ravine. Borders offered another kind of sanctuary term, though one equally uncertain. A fugitive might dream of crossing into a neighbouring city, tribe, kingdom, or imperial frontier where the former master's power weakened. The thought is easy to understand. Beyond the hills, perhaps no one knows the owner. Beyond the river, perhaps the law is different. Beyond the desert, perhaps a community of strangers may accept the runaway as useful, pitiful, or blessed by fate. But borders were not moral transformations. Many ancient societies practiced slavery. A stranger without protection could be captured again, sold again, or forced into dependency under a new name. Even where formal claims did not travel easily, vulnerability did. A fugitive who crossed a frontier might be free from one master and exposed to all others. The problem was not only escape from ownership, it was entry into belonging. Armies sometimes became places of concealment. Military camps were full of movement, noise, animals, merchants, sex workers, servants, porters, craftsmen, captives, veterans, camp followers, and opportunists. A runaway might attach himself to such a moving world, hoping that chaos would hide him. Soldiers needed labour, officers needed servants, supply trains needed hands. War pulled people from place to place, and in that turbulence, identities could blur. Yet the army was also an institution of discipline. It knew how to count bodies, command movement, and punish disorder. A fugitive who entered the orbit of soldiers risked becoming plunder, servant, porter, or suspect. Military life could offer food and movement, but rarely gentleness. To hide among armed men was to seek shade beneath a blade. Distant communities could also shelter fugitives when interest aligned with mercy. A remote village might accept a stranger who could herd animals, repair tools, cut wood, carry water, or marry into a marginal household. A frontier group hostile to a nearby empire might welcome runaways as useful additions or as symbols of defiance. Bandit groups might absorb them. So might mountain peoples, desert clans, marsh dwellers, or communities beyond firm state control. In such places, official ownership might matter less than labour, loyalty, and survival, but such refuge came with its own dangers. Marginal communities were often poor. They might demand harsh work, they might distrust outsiders, they might trade the fugitive if pressure grew, they might protect him one season and abandon him the next. Acceptance was rarely unconditional. The runaway needed more than hiding. He needed a new social skin. Urban anonymity was another sanctuary, and perhaps one of the most tempting. Great cities gathered multitudes, free poor, migrants, artisans, sailors, beggars, entertainers, freed persons, foreigners, merchants, pilgrims, and criminals. In such crowded places, a fugitive might disappear among those already overlooked by the elite. Poverty could become camouflage. A person sleeping near docks, working as a porter, carrying loads in markets, or serving in low taverns might avoid questions if he appeared useful and unremarkable. Yet the city demanded money. Rooms cost money. Food cost money. Bribes cost money. Clothing cost money. Illness cost money. A fugitive without resources could be forced into criminal networks or exploitative work. The very anonymity that concealed could also isolate. No one knew your old master, but no one knew you either. Without witnesses or friends, a person could be cheated, beaten, arrested, or enslaved again. Some runaways sought sanctuary in identity itself. They changed names, invented origins, altered clothing, learned new speech, shaved hair, grew beards, hid scars, adopted trades, or claimed to be freed people. This was perhaps the most daring refuge of all, because it required living inside a constructed self every day. A false identity had to survive casual conversation, anger, drunkenness, illness, love, and memory. One careless word could reopen the past. Freed communities sometimes offered ambiguous refuge. Former slaves knew the condition of bondage and might feel sympathy for fugitives. They also understood danger. Some had obligations to patrons, families to protect, businesses to preserve, and reputations to maintain. Helping a runaway could threaten everything they had struggled to build. Compassion and caution wrestled in the same heart. A freed person might hide a fugitive, or might refuse, not from cruelty, but from fear of being dragged back toward the abyss. Nature itself could become sanctuary for short periods. Marshes, caves, forests, ruins, ravines, abandoned tombs, and remote pastures offered hiding places. The ancient landscape was full of forgotten structures and sacred shadows, ruined walls from older kingdoms, tomb entrances half buried in sand, shepherd shelters, empty watchtowers, dry cisterns, caves smelling of animals and damp stone. A fugitive could survive in such places for days or weeks if food and water could be found. But hiding is not living. A hiding place is a held breath. The longer it lasts, the heavier it becomes. One must emerge for food. One must risk smoke for warmth. One must sleep. One must listen always. A sanctuary without community becomes a slow form of starvation. There is a deep human sorrow in this search for refuge. The enslaved person did not ask for luxury. He asked for a place where no hand could lawfully seize him. She asked for ground beneath the feet that did not belong to the master. They asked for a name that would not summon punishment. In the ancient world, such places existed only in fragments: an altar, a border, a crowd, a cave, A sympathetic stranger, a ship leaving harbour under favourable wind. Sanctuary, then, was not a destination so much as a series of temporary shelters against a pursuing order. It could delay capture, redirect ownership, provide negotiation, or create the first step toward new life. But it rarely erased danger. The fugitive had to keep moving between forms of uncertainty, from sacred pause to legal risk, from foreign road to hunger, from city crowd to loneliness. Still, the appeal to sanctuary reveals something powerful. Even in societies that accepted slavery, there remained unease about absolute power. The idea that a person could run to an altar and be heard means that suffering could not always remain private. The gods, or at least the public space of the gods, could be invoked against cruelty. The result was imperfect, often disappointing, sometimes deadly. Yet the gesture itself mattered. A hand gripping an altar was a declaration. It said that the master's power was not the only power in the universe. It said that the enslaved person could still appeal, still accuse, still force the world to look, beneath carved stone, beneath incense smoke, beneath the painted eyes of divine images. The fugitive stood trembling, terrified, and human. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made in temple archives, boundary settlements, frontier graves, and forgotten urban quarters. Perhaps some names will emerge from the dust, people who crossed into sanctuary and did not vanish entirely. For now, we are left with the image of the runaway at the altar, clinging not to certainty, but to interruption. In a world built to return him, even a single interrupted moment could feel like the opening of heaven. Freedom had a gate, but it was narrow, guarded, and often opened from the outside. For many enslaved people in the ancient world, the most realistic path out of bondage was not flight across a mountain, not revolt under a red sky, not disappearance into a harbour crowd, but manumission. A word spoken by an owner, a document sealed, a payment accepted, a ritual performed, a name altered, a status changed. The human being once held as property could become legally free, or at least freer than before. Yet this form of escape carried its own cruelty. It made freedom depend upon the very system that had denied it. The enslaved person might endure years, even decades, of obedience in the hope that the master would one day release the claim. To reach liberty through manumission often required patience beneath authority, skill without arrogance, loyalty under humiliation, and the careful management of another person's favour. The road to freedom became not a road at all, but a long hallway inside the master's house. Manumission existed in many ancient societies, but it was never simple. Some people were freed as acts of gratitude. Some purchased their freedom through savings. Some were released in wills after an owner's death. Some were dedicated to temples in arrangements that changed their legal dependency. Some were freed because their labour had earned enough profit. Some were freed because age made them less useful. Some were freed because a master wished to appear generous before neighbours, gods, or descendants. This meant that freedom could arrive wrapped in calculation. A man might free an elderly servant after the strongest years had been consumed. A woman might be released only after bearing children who remained enslaved. A skilled worker might be permitted to buy himself, but only after paying a price shaped by the owner's greed. A child raised in bondage might be promised the liberty in adulthood, yet see the promise delayed year after year. The possibility was real, but so was manipulation. In some places, enslaved people could gather small sums of money through side work, tips, market activity, or allowances. This private fund was never fully secure, but it could become the hidden seed of hope, a coin concealed in cloth, a small payment from a customer, a portion of earnings quietly saved, a gift from someone sympathetic. Over time, such fragments might grow into ransom, but every coin saved for freedom also represented risk. A suspicious master could confiscate it, a thief could steal it, illness could consume it, A sudden sale could carry the person away from the agreement entirely. To purchase oneself was a strange and painful transaction. It required accepting the owner's valuation of the captive body. The enslaved person had to pay for what should never have been taken. Freedom became a price placed upon the self by another. The legal act could be joyous, but beneath it lay an injury no ceremony could fully heal. Ransom worked in similar ways for war captives and kidnapped people. Families, temples, cities, patrons, or charitable groups might raise funds to redeem those held in bondage. The returning captive could be welcomed home with tears and offerings, yet not all had someone able to pay. The poor were less likely to be redeemed. The isolated remained vulnerable. A noble prisoner might be exchanged, while a common soldier vanished into labour. As so often in ancient life, status could determine whether suffering was temporary or permanent. Military service sometimes opened a path to freedom, though this varied widely by period and place. States needed men, armies needed bodies. In moments of crisis, rulers could offer liberty to enslaved or dependent people in exchange for service. Such offers reveal the grim arithmetic of power. A person denied civic dignity and peace could be invited to die for the community in war. Freedom might be promised at the edge of a spear. For the enslaved recruit, the choice could be agonizing. Military life brought danger, discipline, wounds, hunger, disease, and the possibility of death far from home. Yet it also offered movement, comradeship, pay in some cases, and a new identity shaped by service rather than ownership. A man who marched with an army might become harder to treat as household property, especially if the state recognized his contribution. Still, the freedom earned by war was never gentle. It was purchased with risk to the body. Patronage formed another narrow gate. A former slave often became a freed person tied to the former master as patron. Legal status improved, but obligation remained. The freed person might owe work, respect, visits, political support, financial duties, or social deference. The old master could become a protector and a burden at once. The relationship changed shape without disappearing. This made ancient freedom layered rather than absolute. A freed person was not always equal to a freeborn citizen. Stigma could linger in name, dress, occupation, speech, and public memory. Neighbours might remember servile origins. Laws might restrict office holding, marriage, inheritance, or testimony depending on society and era. The freed person might possess legal personhood, yet still move through a world that marked the past as shame. Yet we should not diminish what manumission meant. To be free, even imperfectly, could transform the horizon of life. A person might marry with greater security, save wealth, join associations, worship publicly, build a household, protect children, choose employment, own tools, make contracts, stand in court with stronger recognition, travel with less fear. Speak a name that was not merely a label of property. The difference between slavery and freedom could be the difference between breathing inside a closed room and breathing beneath the sky. Many freed people became vital parts of ancient economies. They worked as merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, administrators, sailors, bankers, teachers, performers, and household managers. Some prospered, some used their skills, contacts, and knowledge of elite households to build new lives. Some purchased the freedom of relatives. Some became patrons themselves. In their stories, we see not merely survival, but reconstruction. Still, freedom through obedience carried a haunting question. How much of oneself had to be hidden to reach it? How many insults swallowed? How many punishments endured? How many years spent proving loyalty to someone who owned your labour? The enslaved person seeking lawful release had to master the art of appearing safe to power. Anger had to be folded inward. Talent had to be useful but not threatening. Intelligence had to serve. Hope had to wait. This waiting could become its own captivity. A master might hint at manumission without promising it. A mistress might praise devotion but never sign the document. An owner might say, "Serve me until my death, and then you shall be free," but death could come late. Wills could be contested. Heirs could resist. Records could disappear. A promised freedom might dissolve in family quarrels, debt, or greed. The enslaved person had little power to enforce a promise made by those who already possessed legal dominance. Age also shadowed the narrow gate. Freedom granted late in life was precious, but it could arrive after the body had been spent. What does it mean to be freed after youth has vanished? To step into liberty with damaged joints, poor teeth, weak sight, and no family left? Some elderly freed people must have felt both gratitude and grief. The door opened, but behind them lay years that could not return. For women, the road to manumission could be especially entangled with vulnerability. A female slave might be freed by a male owner who had exploited her. She might be released while her children remained bound. She might become a freed woman still dependent on the household where harm had occurred. Legal freedom did not automatically restore bodily autonomy, social honour, or family unity. The old power could linger in memory, obligation, and fear. Children born to freed persons entered a changed world. In some societies, descendants could rise further than the freed generation. A child or grandchild might become more fully accepted into civic life. Thus, manumission could be a seed planted for the future. Even when the first person freed still carried stigma, freedom could unfold across generations. A name once associated with bondage might, with time, become attached to property, trade, marriage, and public respect. This generational hope helps explain why some endured. A person might accept paternal duties not for personal comfort, but so children could stand on firmer ground. Ancient freedom was often a family project. One life bore the weight, so another could walk lighter. There were also those who never received lawful release yet created small freedoms within bondage. They negotiated better tasks, formed families, saved money, gained trust, protected children, cultivated allies, or carved private dignity from public subordination. These were not substitutes for freedom, but they were forms of human agency. The enslaved were not passive figures waiting for rescue. They interpreted the world, made choices under pressure, and pursued survival through every available crack. Freedom's narrow gate reveals why escape was nearly impossible in another sense. The system offered limited alternatives that could discourage flight. Why risk death on the road if patience might bring release? Why rebel if a master's favour might protect your child? Why run when your savings are almost enough? Why endanger your loved ones when a will may free you? These questions did not make slavery humane. They made it more intricate. They tied hope to obedience, and obedience to hope. Yet hope controlled by the master remained unstable. True freedom is not a gift when another person may withhold it at whim. The ancient freed person's joy was therefore mixed with the knowledge that liberty had passed through the hands of ownership. The ceremony might change status, but memory remained. The body remembered commands, the mind remembered calculation, the heart remembered those left behind. At the threshold of manumission, we may imagine a person standing in the light, hearing words that alter everything. The owner's claim falls away, perhaps fully, perhaps partially, perhaps with conditions. The air feels different. The street outside seems both familiar and new, yet the world does not become innocent. The freed person must build a life from fragments, a name, a skill, a few coins, a patron's shadow, a memory of fear, and a future not yet trusted. Freedom was possible. That is important, but its narrowness tells us much about the world that surrounded it. A society confident in justice would not make liberty so difficult to obtain. A civilization secure in its moral order would not require the enslaved to purchase themselves, flatter owners, survive war, or wait upon deathbeds for recognition of their humanity. And still, when the gate opened, however narrowly, people stepped through, some with bowed heads, some with tears, some with children in their arms, some alone, some old, some young, some carrying tools, some carrying scars, some whispering the names of those who had not lived to see it. The gate was narrow, but beyond it lay the possibility of a self no longer listed among possessions, fragile, partial, contested, and watched, yes, but real enough to change the meaning of dawn. Slavery did not end when kingdoms fell. This is one of the most sobering realities in the long study of the ancient world. Palaces burned, dynasties vanished, languages changed their scripts, temples lost their worshippers, armies broke apart, roads were abandoned to weeds, harbours filled with silt, statues were toppled, buried, or recarved with the faces of new rulers. Yet the practice of owning, buying, selling, commanding, and coercing human beings survived these transformations with a terrible adaptability. Civilizations can collapse quickly in the eyes of later historians, but human institutions often dissolve more slowly. A capital city may be sacked in a single season, a royal house may end in a single murder, a military frontier may break within a year, but households remain, fields remain, debts remain, hunger remains, captives remain, the need for labour remains. Those who possess wealth seek to preserve it, and those without protection are made vulnerable to new forms of domination. When an empire weakened, the enslaved did not necessarily find release. Disorder could create openings, but it could also multiply danger. A collapsing state might lose the ability to enforce one master's claim, yet war bands, local strongmen, creditors, raiders, and desperate communities could create new claims. The fall of one authority did not guarantee the rise of justice. In many cases, it meant that violence became less predictable. Imagine a frontier province after imperial control has thinned. The tax office no longer functions as it once did. Roads are less guarded. Soldiers have not been paid. Local elites fortify estates. Villages watch the horizon for raiders. Trade falters. Coin becomes scarce. Grain is hidden. In such a world, a slave might dream that the master's power is weakening. Perhaps it is. But beyond the estate gate, other powers are gathering. A runaway might avoid one owner only to be seized by armed men who care nothing for old documents and everything for useful bodies. War was one of slavery's great engines. Whenever states fractured, war captives increased. People displaced by siege, famine, and raiding could be sold into bondage or forced into dependency. Children separated from families became vulnerable. Widows without protection could be coerced. Refugees arriving hungry at city gates could accept terms that stripped them of freedom in exchange for survival. Collapse did not abolish the market of flesh. It fed it. Environmental stress could deepen the trap. Drought, flood, crop failure, soil exhaustion, disease among animals, and shifting climate patterns placed pressure on ancient societies. Archaeologists and climate historians have shown that environmental change could interact with political and economic weakness in powerful ways. When food systems broke, the poor suffered first. Debt rose. Families sold land, tools, animals, and sometimes themselves or their children into dependency. In such moments, the boundary between free poverty and servile labour could become dangerously thin. The Younger Dryas belongs to a much earlier human story, long before many of the best-known slave systems of classical antiquity, yet it reminds us of a larger truth. Climate shocks can alter the direction of societies. Droughts can unsettle settlements. Floods can destroy stored grain. Failed harvests can make old arrangements impossible. In later ancient worlds, environmental stress did not act alone, but it sharpened existing inequalities. Those with storehouses gained power. Those without food lost choices. Slavery adapted because it could wear many masks. It could appear as household service, plantation labour, mining, debt bondage, temple dependency, state punishment, military captivity, domestic concubinage, workshop production, or rural tenancy shading into coercion. When one form became less useful, another could expand. When cities declined, estates might grow stronger. When conquest slowed, debt could supply workers. When coin grew scarce, labour obligations could replace wages. The institution survived because it was not one rigid structure. It was a family of coercions. Religious change did not immediately end it either. Ancient religions contained many ideas about justice, mercy, hierarchy, fate, purity, sacrifice, and divine order. Some traditions offered compassion toward the vulnerable. Some sacred texts and teachings urged better treatment of servants, captives, and the poor. Some religious communities redeemed captives, protected the desperate, or softened certain abuses. Yet belief and practice did not move together in a straight line. A person could worship a god of mercy and still own slaves. A temple could feed the poor and hold dependents. A preacher could speak of the soul's dignity while society preserved legal inequality. As new religious movements spread through late antiquity, the moral imagination of slavery shifted but did not vanish. The enslaved might be recognized as spiritually equal before the divine, yet remained socially subordinate in law and labor. This tension is one of the great unresolved chords of the ancient transition. The language of inner equality could coexist without a bondage. The soul might be declared precious, while the body remained under another person's command. Only time would reveal how such tensions would unfold. In some places, religious institutions became important in manumission, ransom, charity, and protection. In other places, they inherited land, workers, and old hierarchies. Human beings are skilled at carrying old habits into new sanctuaries. The name of the god may change while the servants still rise before dawn. Economic transformation also altered the shape of captivity. As some urban markets contracted, rural estates became more significant in many regions. Large landowners sought stable labour forces tied to the soil. Some free peasants fell into dependency through debt, tax burden, or need for protection. They were not always slaves in the old legal sense. Yet their movement could be restricted, and their obligations inherited. Here we see a slow transition from ancient slavery toward other systems of unfreedom. The chain changed its material. Iron gave way, in some places, to rent, debt, custom, and lordship. This is why the end of the ancient world should not be imagined as a clean moral sunrise. The collapse of classical structures did not produce universal freedom. It produced rearrangement. Some slaves were freed. Some were absorbed into new social categories. Some became estate labourers tied to land. Some remained household slaves. Some were taken in new wars. Some were redeemed by kin or religious groups. Some disappeared entirely from the record. For the historian, this transition is difficult because terminology shifts. Words change meaning across time and place. Legal categories blur. A person described as a servant in one document may have been free, bound, dependent, enslaved, or somewhere between. Stratigraphic excavation can show changes in settlement size, diet, housing, production, and burial practice. Genomic data can reveal migration, violence, and population mixing. Radiocarbon dating can fix a settlement layer within a century or generation. But the inner texture of freedom and coercion often remains hard to grasp. Still, the material record speaks. Smaller houses built into the ruins of great public structures suggest changing social worlds. Fortified hilltops suggest insecurity. Hoards buried and never recovered suggest fear. Cemeteries with signs of stress suggest hardship. Workshops abandoned or reorganized suggest economic transition. Roads declining while local strongholds rise suggest the shrinking of imperial reach. In such landscapes, Slavery did not simply disappear, it moved through the cracks. The enslaved themselves experienced these transitions not as eras, but as days. A change of ruler meant something only if it changed the hand that commanded them. A new religion meant something only if it protected their body, reunited their family, or opened a path to freedom. A collapsed tax system meant something only if it reduced hunger rather than inviting raids. Grand history passes in chapters. Human suffering passes in mornings. There must have been moments when collapse opened doors. A master killed in war, records burned in a city fire, a household scattered during invasion, a border post abandoned, a harbour thrown into confusion, a fugitive blending into columns of refugees. A woman taking a new name in a village where no one knew the old one. A child born in flight and never registered as property. Such moments rarely leave monuments. They are the soft footprints of freedom across mud, soon erased by weather. There must also have been moments when collapse closed every door, a family sold during famine, a village seized by raiders, a debtor handing over a child, a soldier capturing refugees beside a broken road, a former house slave dragged into rural labour under harsher conditions, a freed person unable to prove status when old records vanished. Disorder could erase bondage, but it could also erase protection. This is the great cruelty of historical transition. It does not move evenly. One person's chaos is another person's opportunity. One household's ruin is another market's supply. One empire's fall is another warlord's harvest. To say slavery survived collapse is not to say nothing changed. Much changed. Laws changed. Economies changed. Religious languages changed. Military structures changed. Cities shrank or transformed. Rural authority hardened in some regions. Long-distance trade declined in some places and flourished in others. New peoples entered old lands. Old elites adapted, failed, or merged with conquerors. The institution of slavery shifted with these forces like a dark river finding new channels. That adaptability is what makes the history so unsettling. Slavery was not attached only to one culture, one empire, one religion, one economy, or one ideology. It found justification in conquest, debt, punishment, birth, household order, racialized difference in some contexts, ethnic difference in others, religious difference in later worlds, and simple greed almost everywhere. It survived because powerful people repeatedly found ways to make captivity useful, and yet, continuity was never total. Resistance continued too. Flight continued, manumission continued, ransom continued, hidden families continued, negotiation continued, prayer continued. The enslaved and the dependent did not vanish into categories. They lived through the ending of worlds. They carried water among ruins. They harvested fields under new banners. They heard new languages of authority. They watched old masters fall and new masters rise. Some seized opportunity. Some were crushed by change. Some endured long enough for their children to inherit a different status. As the ancient world transformed, the meaning of escape changed with it. In a stable empire, escape might mean outrunning law. In a collapsing frontier, it might mean surviving lawlessness. In a changing religious order, it might mean appealing to new forms of mercy. In a ruralizing economy, it might mean avoiding attachment to land. In a world of war, it might mean not being captured twice. The brutal reality remained that freedom required more than the absence of a master. It required food, recognition, protection, community, and a future secure enough to sleep without listening for footsteps. Collapse could remove one obstacle and create 10 more. Transition could open a path, then bury it beneath hunger. Among the ruins of antiquity, where grass grows through paving stones and owls nest in broken towers, we may be tempted to see endings, but human systems often survive in altered forms long after their palaces fall. The old chains rust, new obligations are written, the market moves, the estate changes hands, the name for the labourer shifts, the need for freedom remains. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Somewhere in the centuries of fire and migration, there were people who stepped out of slavery because the world around them broke. Somewhere there were people who fell into slavery for the same reason. Their names are scattered beyond recovery, answerless, adrift to ponder. What remains is the warning carved into the long road of history. Injustice does not die merely because a kingdom dies. It must be dismantled by human choice, or it learns to live beneath another name. The long shadow of ancient slavery does not fall only across ruins. It falls across the way we speak about civilization itself. It darkens the polished marble, the golden masks, the royal inscriptions, the measured columns, the painted tombs, the victorious reliefs, the wide roads, the great harbours, and the quiet tablets stored in museum drawers. It asks us to look again at the ancient world, not with contempt and not with romance, but with a steadier gaze. For the same societies that reached toward beauty also built systems of captivity. The same hands that shaped wonder could be owned by others. This is not a reason to turn away from antiquity. It is a reason to look more deeply. Ancient people were not simple shadows walking through a childish age. They were our intellectual and moral equals, capable of tenderness, cruelty, invention, fear, love, faith, ambition, cowardice, and courage. They looked at the stars and measured seasons. They prayed beside river water. They buried their dead with care. They wrote laws, poems, hymns, contracts, curses, letters, and philosophical questions that still trouble the mind. And among them lived the enslaved, not as footnotes to civilization, but as makers of its daily life. They cooked the meals, they carried the water, they dressed the children, they cleaned the courtyards, they rowed, dug, harvested, nursed, copied, counted, sang, hammered, ground, hauled, and built. They listened in rooms where powerful people spoke freely because servants were treated as furniture. They knew secrets of households, prices in markets, weaknesses in masters, and the rhythms of the city before dawn. They were everywhere, yet so often unnamed. This is why the question of escape matters. It is not merely a question of movement, it is a question of world design. Why was escape nearly impossible? Because ancient slavery was not only a relationship between master and slave, it was an environment. It was law, hunger, distance, punishment, surveillance, debt, religion, market, family, language, status, and memory woven together into a net. The enslaved person did not face a single locked door. He faced a civilization of locks. Yet nearly impossible does not mean impossible. There were those who ran. There were those who hid. There were those who saved coins for years and bought themselves from the condition forced upon them. There were those who stood at altars trembling. There were those who joined armies, followed caravans, slipped onto ships, crossed frontiers, vanished into cities, or lived under new names. There were those who rebelled with fire in their hearts, knowing that the world would answer with iron. There were those who could not flee because children were sleeping nearby. There were those who remained in order to protect someone weaker. There were those who dreamed silently until death. Their courage took many forms. The archaeological record catches only fragments of them. A collar, a shackle, a cramped room, a burial with signs of hard labour, a sales contract, a freed person's inscription, a legal dispute, a skeleton marked by repetitive strain, a road worn by countless feet, a broken storage jar in a servant's quarter. Radiocarbon dating gives us time. Stratigraphic excavation gives us layers. Lithic analysis gives us tools and stone sources. Genomic data can reveal migration, displacement, and ancestry. But no method can fully recover the sound of a mother deciding whether to run with her child or remain. No instrument can measure the exact weight of fear before a locked gate. Still, the evidence matters. It prevents forgetting from becoming easy. It places the enslaved back into the story of civilization, where they always were. It reminds us that monuments are not only triumphs of kings, but also accumulations of labour. A wall is not merely stone. It is decisions, orders, food rations, sore hands, overseers, engineers, transport routes, and human endurance. A palace is not merely royal taste. It is the life of everyone who swept its floors, mixed its plaster, carried its lamps, and feared its inner rooms. When we stand in imagination before an ancient city at sunset, we should let it remain beautiful. The bronze light on the roofs, the river darkening, the smell of bread and smoke, the calling of animals at the gate, the temple steps cooling after heat, the first lamps opening like small stars along the streets. But we should also hear what beauty can hide. A child being counted as property, a woman listening for footsteps, a man touching a scar, a runaway waiting in reeds until the moon is high enough to see the path. History is not made honest by stripping away wonder. It is made honest by allowing wonder and sorrow to stand together. The legacy of ancient slavery also warns us about the danger of making injustice ordinary. Few systems survive by appearing monstrous to those who benefit from them. They survive by becoming normal. A master tells himself he is practical. A buyer tells himself he follows custom. A judge tells himself he upholds law. A neighbour tells himself it is not his affair. A priest tells himself order must be preserved. A poor informer tells himself the reward will feed his family. Each small justification becomes a brick in a wall that others must live behind. This is perhaps the deepest lesson. Cruelty does not always arrive wearing the face of hatred. Sometimes it arrives as paperwork, as household management, as inherited custom, as economic necessity, as a legal category, as a word everyone uses without thinking. Ancient slavery became powerful because it taught people to stop seeing the enslaved as full human beings. Once that vision failed, almost anything could be justified, and yet the enslaved kept proving the lie. Every attempt to escape declared personhood. Every hidden coin declared planning. Every protected child declared love. Every prayer declared inward life. Every rebellion declared political imagination. Every negotiated freedom declared persistence. Every remembered homeland declared that ownership could not reach all the way into the soul. The system named them property. Their actions answered, "We are human." The long road of human history is filled with such contradictions. We inherit mathematics from societies that exploited captives. We inherit architecture from worlds of forced labour. We inherit legal traditions from cultures that denied legal personhood to many. We inherit poetry from cities where some voices were silenced by design. To study this honestly is not to reject the past, but to refuse a shallow admiration of it. The past does not ask us to worship it, it asks us to understand it. And understanding must include humility. Future discoveries will change details. A new excavation may reveal a slave quarter where none was expected. A new reading of a tablet may alter what we believe about debt bondage. A cemetery examined through genomic data may show movement, violence, kinship, and displacement hidden beneath old assumptions. A humble object in a museum storeroom may one day speak louder than a king's inscription. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The names of millions are gone, their laughter is gone, their private jokes, favourite foods, childhood memories, songs, accents, fears, and small victories have mostly vanished. We know systems better than we know souls. We know prices better than faces. We know laws better than dreams. That absence is itself part of the wound. So we end not with certainty, but with attention, Imagine one enslaved person standing at the edge of night. The household sleeps behind. The road is somewhere ahead, unseen but real. The stars are cold. A dog turns in the dust. Somewhere in the distance, water moves through a canal or river. The person knows the danger, hunger, pursuit, betrayal, punishment, the possible suffering of those left behind. The world is vast, and yet it feels tightly closed. Still, the thought comes, I was not born to be owned. That thought is ancient. It may be as old as captivity itself. It crosses languages, empires, religions, and ruins. It survives in records written by enemies. It survives in scars. It survives in desperate laws against runaways. It survives in punishments designed to crush it. It survives because the human self resists becoming an object. The brutal reality of ancient slavery is that escape was made nearly impossible by a world built to return the fugitive. The deeper reality is that people kept seeking escape anyway, through roads, rituals, bargains, rebellions, memory, and hope. That is where the darkness of this history meets its fragile light. Among the broken columns and buried tablets, among the scorched deserts and the wide banks of ancient rivers, among the silent rooms where servants once moved before dawn, there remains a question for us. What kind of world are we building around the vulnerable? A world of locks or a world of doors? The ancient enslaved are not merely gone. They are part of the long human road beneath our feet. Their labour shaped the civilizations we study. Their suffering exposes the cost of power without conscience. Their resistance reminds us that freedom is not an ornament of society, but one of the deepest needs of the human soul. And as night settles over the ruins of memory, we leave them not as shadows, but as people, tired, frightened, clever, loving, wounded, patient, furious, and alive. They walked beneath the same moon. They felt dust beneath their feet. They listened for danger in the dark. They dreamed of morning. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we stand at the edge of their silence. And if we listen closely, beyond the empire, beyond the market, beyond the whip and the law, we may still hear the oldest whisper of freedom moving through the ancient world like wind through broken stone. End of script. Good night.